Da 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 da!
Hello, everyone. It is good old Jeremy Temple, or some of you may know me, Jeremiah Germs, here from Phantom Studios, and this has been something we've been planning to do for a long time. Like, I'm pretty sure it's been over a year since this idea has been thought of. But hopefully this will come out sooner than our previous attempt tried to come out. But anyway, this is the top 10 most influential wars in history. Basically, wars that have had the most impact on history, whether it's the history of warfare itself, the weapons that were used, or just the history of the world entirely, how it changed it.
Or even the aftermath.
Yeah, and I am here with my older brother, Caleb Temple. Basically, how we're going to do this, first we're going to start off with Caleb. Every time we get onto a different war, Caleb will start off and he'll basically talk about the basic overall history and probably the combat. And then I'll be talking about the weapons and how they were used and the technology. Because we specialize in different things when it comes to this, so it works out perfectly. Number 10.
The Spanish Civil War. Alright, just going straight into this. This has a lot of... Okay, there's one thing that does draw a little bit of misconceptions in this, in that there's a particular man from England who was a journalist who fought against the fascist rebels in Spain on the side of the communists. And some people think that would... and this man's name is George Orwell. He's very famous. He's the guy that wrote that anti-communist thing, Pig Farm. Spanish Civil War... Really, if anything, all this ever did as an influence in history was it prevented Hitler from having to take the Iberian Peninsula. He had a somewhat fascist ally in Spain who didn't really fight. Spain stayed neutral throughout the war, same with Portugal, but it prevented communism from having any kind of foothold there where Hitler would have to spend more resources there. Now, am I saying that I'm okay with that? No. I would have preferred the communists to win because it would have meant that Hitler would have had to overextend himself even further. But for the luck that we have, Spain did not enter World War II because of this. And the catch is, with this, really all the war was just small-scale skirmishes or large-scale open battles. What these skirmishes will most likely be is guerrilla-style tactics, or you would have just massive tanks slamming into each other. And the communists did not have good tank supply, or good tanks in general. The BT series and the T-62.
Which I'll get a little more in depth when I talk about the weapons.
Yes, and in regard to the fascists, they had support from Italy and Germany, which was actually predominantly which was predominantly a flamethrower tank, and the Panzer I. But enough about that. The fascist rebels controlled most of the country, from its northern border to its border with Portugal to its African territory across the Strait of Gibraltar in Morocco. Whereas the communists controlled Madrid and a small chunk of central Spain that stretched out towards the coast. The Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean were also dominated by the nationalist rebels. So basically, the Spanish Civil War was just basically a war that did involve some of the major powers in Europe, but not that many of them. It only involved Italy and Germany and Russia. But Italy, Germany, and Russia did not send troops. They sent weapons. They let the Spanish duke it out.
Alright, and of course I'll be talking into technology and weaponry use. So, of course, SMGs made their debut late in World War I. Germany, at the very end of World War I, came up with the real first well-known and successful SMG, the MP-18, which this and its predecessors, the MP-28 and MP-36, I think they were used in the Spanish Civil War and they were used to quite great effect. SMGs, of course, were still relatively new, and so they were still trying to find their footing. Of course, with Germany having some experience with these weapons in the war, they would figure out what purpose they would serve, which SMGs in World War II would eventually, for the Germans, go on to be close-range support for MGs. And speaking of which, the main MG they used was the MG-34 from 1934, and this was a very reliable and lightweight machine gun, though be it a little expensive. And also the tanks. I love tanks. I
love tanks.
Tell that to death. But, of course, like Caleb said earlier, they didn't have... The communists didn't have the heaviest of tanks. They had the BT series of tanks, like the BT-2, the slightly more up-to-gun BT-5, and the T-26, which the T-26 probably had the biggest rollout of any tank in the war, as far as what I know.
If anything, I would have trusted the BT-5 more than the T-26.
The T-26, I think, had trialed, and I think it was more trialed than tested. It had been around for longer. Like the earliest versions of the T-26 were from 1931, whereas the BT-5 was from 1933, so it was a little newer on the scene. But the T-26, but anyway, the BT-5 and T-26, they both had the same turret. The model 1933 BT-26 had the same turret as the BT-5, which mounted a 45mm anti-tank gun. The BT-2 only having a 37mm anti-tank gun. Of course, BT-2 didn't really make it into World War II, as far as I'm concerned. If it did, it was probably very limited. And of course, on the German side, they had a lot of the early Panzer series, like the Panzer I and Panzer II tanks, which were small, light, but relatively fast for many of the tanks Germany used to produce.
In regard to the Panzers, though, the Panzer II actually had the heavier armament, which was a 20mm cannon as opposed to just the machine guns on the Panzer I.
Yeah, the Panzer I had two MG-34 machine guns, whereas the Panzer II had an MG-34 and a 20mm autocannon.
Which, by the way, German 20mm autocannons, they tear anything to shreds. Also, there is also the other vehicle, the Italian one.
Oh, yes. I forgot its name. I'll put the name and the picture up on screen right now, but it was a small Italian tanket that towed its own carriage behind it, which contained flame fuel for its flamethrower, which it was around the 1930s, mid to late 1930s, when flamethrower tanks started to come into their own.
And the catch is with that vehicle, it's already as much of a death wish because that thing is pathetic with armor. Number 9
is the Vietnam War.
So, Vietnam, the disaster of command. This war is one that I do not look fondly upon. Vietnam was basically the U.S. testing whether or not we actually could maintain influence because, a few years before, we had Kennedy's assassination, the escalation of violence, and of course the disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vietnam was a disaster of a war. We didn't want to get it scaled up, but then it ended up getting scaled up anyway. And then we slowly eventually pulled out. We should never have left. But the thing is that we were totally unprepared for this, because the kind of warfare that they did back in that day was mainly jungle warfare. Because Vietnam is nothing but dense jungle and marsh and swamp. Now, the initial commander was a decent tactician, one of the most famous men. He was responsible for Korea. He was one of the main commanders in World War II against the Japanese. Douglas MacArthur, the man who swore he'd liberate the Philippines, and he did. So what happened later on was that the war progressed very rapidly. Eventually other commanders came in, and it just got worse. But the catch is, we actually were somewhat winning the war by the middle of the war. We were actually starting to win. The reason? Vietnam and China were not friends, unlike with North Korea. China had a much closer cultural tie to North Korea than Vietnam, and Vietnam had been an ancient enemy of China. So China was not helping the Russians get supplies to the Vietnamese. Basically, with this, we kept causing we kept hitting the cities in the north. We kept hitting lots of crap like that. And the catch is, we were just slamming this Vietnam. We actually engaged the enemy in a large-scale battle. We lost 300 men, but the enemy had suffered almost nearly 10 times that, with 300,000 casualties. The North Vietnamese army was completely wiped out. The NVA was completely wiped out because of this. But the catch is, the public only could see the 300 that we had lost. No, wait, it was only 30 that we lost. We only lost 30. They lost, like, I don't know, some, like, 3,000 guys. So, the North Vietnamese army was badly weakened and was hammered at every turn. And the Marines were doing a good job at holding. The problem is that the politicians, especially the Presidents Nixon and Johnson were idiots trying to play field commander from the White House. You never do that, for one. And for two, you let field commanders make the decision on the ground. And the problem is also was that public support was not doing good with it, because it was a lot of hippies, love and peace movement, and public opinion just fell apart. And the media also had far too much access. They were showing the cruel actions of the Marines, killing women and children. Well, newsflash there, liberal media. The Marines were getting shot at by these women and children who were Viet Cong troopers in disguise out in the rice fields, who would shoot at them at night. So they had to shoot at them in order to make it so they had to shoot at them in order to prevent the war from getting in order to prevent them from getting shot at when they landed.
Of course, World War II is when the assault rifle made its debut in combat with the STG-44. Of course, assault rifles would become mainstay afterwards, with, of course, America early in the Vietnam War using the M14, but just only, I think it was only 2 years into the war, they introduced the new M16. Which,
one reason, real quick, I learned actually why the M14 got phased out. It's more of a sniper rifle. The M14 can hit something at almost 1,000 yards distance. And a field study conducted by the German Army before World War I, mind you, actually confirmed that most engagements occurred at some 350 meters. So a weapon that can hit at 1,000 meters is completely overpowered. It's not worth it. Plus, the weapon
because most soldiers would engage at closer distances.
Yeah, they wouldn't engage at such long distances. And on top of all that, the weapon was heavy, it was a cumbersome design, and it was and the ammo was heavy too. Now, I'm not saying against it. I'm not against the M14. I love the M14. I think it's a beautiful weapon. It's just, it was not good for swampy jungle warfare. That is the worst weapon you could possibly lug into battle. But in a sandy condition like in the Middle East, they work a lot better.
Of course, like he said, M14, it is very accurate, very powerful, but just not what. But it was also expensive. Ammunition was very big, heavy to carry.
And the weapon, in fact, on the official list of top 10 rifles of all time, they actually said that soldiers in Vietnam struggled with the weight of the weapon and its ammunition.
So, the M14 is still used today by special forces as a special sniper rifle, and from what I've heard, many people who I've seen comments on YouTube on different videos from veterans who said they pretty much fired every gun the military has to offer, and the M14 is probably the best out of all of them. The M16 was introduced to fix a lot of the problems. It was, of course, the M14, its ammunition, and the weapon itself was heavy. So the M16 came along using mostly plastic parts, which many soldiers, because of that, thought of it like a toy, calling it the Mattel 16. And also, it used a smaller round to help with decreasing the weight of its ammunition as well. And instead of using the original 7.62 NATO round, the
7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO round.
They ended up using the 5.56 millimeter, which is also a NATO round, I think.
Yeah, it's a later rendition of the NATO round. And another thing with that, with the smaller round, you can carry more ammunition with you. Meaning you're still carrying the same amount of weight, but you're carrying more ammunition with you, meaning that you don't have to worry about running out as much.
Yes.
But you still need to keep your commander informed in the field. This is just from my own ROTC training experience. Like, whenever you actually use ammunition, you have, like, certain cohorts, like black, green, gold, or something like that, like black, blue, green, stuff like that. And what this could mean is that or yellow, green, black actually. Black means you're completely out. Yellow means you need to refill. And green is before you ever do anything. Meaning before you ever take a drink of water, before you ever need medical supply, before you ever need more ammunition. You're all clear to go, and you're going into combat, or you've just been resupplied. Sorry.
And of course, using the smaller round made many soldiers doubt its lethality, which gave it another nickname, the Poodle Shooter.
That's terrible.
Did you know that name?
No, I did not.
Yeah.
There's something I don't know.
You live and you learn. But
yes.
actually, it wasn't all bad. The round was actually effective in using logistics in its favor. Instead of basically being powerful and going straight through someone with a large entry wound and a larger exit wound, it would instead flatten and tumble when it hit flesh, causing immense internal damage.
Essentially, a modern rendition of the old musket ball.
Yeah.
Musket balls and even the mini A ball from the Civil War would often do that because they were made of soft lead.
Mm-hmm. So, but for the weapon itself, it had many problems. The first M16s, one of the major problems is it was said to be a gun that never needed to be clean, which that was not true. It actually jammed more than the M14 ever would in jungle conditions. If anything got in the barrel or the chamber, it would easily jam. One of the biggest reasons for this was the lack of a chrome-blind chamber, and so due to this, cleaning kits were made and rushed over to the war, and eventually, about I think 4 years into the war,
and they even included a comic called showing soldiers how to clean with attractive female models. Showing the soldiers how to take apart and clean their sweet 16s, you know. Mm-hmm. It's weird stuff in the 60s.
Around mid to later in the war, the M16A1 came along, and
that's a decent weapon.
And it introduced a chrome-blind chamber, which helped.
Also, a better muzzle brake that helped the dirt not to get into the barrel.
In fact, the image I am showing right now is actually of an M16A1. You can tell by the muzzle brake.
Yes, the muzzle brake is a very clear indication. And look, the M16A1 and any later renditions are fine weapons. Like the M4A1 carbine rifle that is currently used by the U.S. military today.
Yeah,
that is perfectly fine.
Many special forces, because it is one of the most versatile and customizable weapons out there. But of course, the M16 was also rivaling against probably one of the most well-known assault rifles in all history, the AK-47/AKM, which the AK-47 probably was not used as much because the AKM is the more popular variant, because the AK-47 had a lot of production problems, so the AKM came in 1952, which I think that at what point was that in the war? Was that like beginning?
1952. That's before 1952. That's before the war, because 1953 is when Korea ended.
All right,
and then Vietnam got started like 1967, and it didn't end until 1974.
All right.
Yeah, that's when we finally pulled out, and the South Vietnam got overwhelmed, and we screwed up.
There are several differences between the AKM and AK-47. The difference is the muzzle brake and the spines on the back. The
catches with
the
this
the AK-47 doesn't have spines on the back to where the AKM does, and the AKM also has that kind of that it has that muzzle brake, or it has that, it's not a muzzle brake, it just has a muzzle that kind of has the bottom part sticks out more than the top, whereas the standard AK-47 doesn't. It just has a standard muzzle at the end. Yeah.
And anyway, going on with the AK, what could you do to make it stop firing? Not a whole lot. Probably drive over with a tank, or simply have it melted down.
Yeah. Because the AK series of weapons have known to been some of the most reliable weapons out there, and it's actually and the reliability actually can span back to Russia in World War II. They needed weapons that could be easily produced and were both reliable. One of the most popular examples is the PPSH-41. The Viet Cong were using the AK-47/AKMs, and America was using the M16, and of course the AK-47 came out on the winning side, especially since the early M16s had reliability issues.
Yeah, and of course, you can't argue with Mikhail Kalashnikov, the inventor of the AK-47.
So,
you cannot argue with his design.
Mm-hmm. Though, of course, he, like many communist people, he was a little ignorant. He said that no attachments should ever be put on the AK-47. It should be plain. That was his concept for it. Now, of course, companies today have found ways around that, making attachments that attach on, and then you can put accessories on that.
And the catch is that the AK-47 is actually so reliable that you could take parts of AK-47s from multiple different countries. Like, you could have a Somali receiver, you could have a Russian...
A Yugoslavian barrel.
A Yugoslav barrel, a Chinese stock, a Vietnamese trigger. And it'll work, and it's like a Frankenstein rifle, and it'll work no different than a normal, fresh out of the factory, automatic Kalashnikov.
And the M16, it needed extensive cleaning and a specialized cleaning kit, and you had a whole instruction manual on how to clean it properly and everything.
Yeah.
AK-47, open up the cover on top of the barrel, and there's its guts, and I heard from the top 10 assault rifles of all time that one of the guys said he saw Afghan soldiers tie their bootlaces into a multitude of knots, dip in motor oil, put it in the barrel, and yank it out, and that was clean enough.
The AK does not require a lot of maintenance for it to function.
When a war's over, like World War II, you would always look at every side to figure out how to overcome your faults and everything, and America did not really have a very good light machine gun, or I wouldn't say not very good, I would just say it wasn't as good as other light machine guns. Like, they had the Browning automatic rifle. That was their light machine gun. But Germany had the MG42, which was an excellent light machine gun that could fire off more rounds, and it was incredibly easy to mass produce compared to the VAR. And so America took inspiration from that and also other weapons. I even heard they took inspiration from a Belgian machine gun that was relatively new on the scene. I think it was the FN Mag. They took like components from that. This new machine gun that they created was dubbed the M60 and was actually probably the most reliable new weapon that America deployed. It was actually no. It did actually have tendencies to jam and stop, though it succeeded in filling the need for a light machine gun. But though it did need extensive care after being used, which gave it the name the Pig. But in a firefight, it could definitely help in with suppressing fire. And of course, many sniper weapons during World War II and before were just infantry rifles with scopes. Like in World War I, it was usually just bolt action rifles.
Like the Kar 98K, the LaBelle,
the Springfield,
the Lee Enfield SMLE.
Afterwards, specialized sniper weapons began to become more common. Now, of course, there have always been, even back in World War I, there were some experimental examples, or not so as common examples, of sniper-only weapons, but it was just easier to take an already existing weapon and put a scope on it. But eventually, sniper specialized weapons would eventually appear. One of the most popular of the Vietnam War was the Remington M24, which is still used today as the U.S.'s I wouldn't say necessarily light sniper rifle, but just
No,
mainstay sniper rifle. Yeah, the M24 would become the specialized sniper rifle, and it was very effective for doing what it was designed to, and was probably the most reliable weapon that America issued during the war. Though it really didn't see too many of mucky conditions because it would usually be sitting back at further distances.
Yep.
And of course, despite the fact that
It was jungle warfare.
it was jungle warfare, tanks were used and were surprisingly successful. Most of them by America.
To an extent.
There were I think there were like a small handful of tank-on-tank battles, though more often than not, America had more tanks, and the Viet Cong were
and
using...
the NVA. They were
and
the
the
enemy's
NVA.
army.
The tanks they were using were most likely leftover Russian tanks from World War II, or maybe even before. So most likely you would see T-34s. And America, they had three. There were three of the most common tanks to see in the Vietnam War were the M41 Walker Bulldog light tank, the M551 Sheridan, and the M48 Patton, which the Patton was pretty much the only war that it was ever good with fighting in was the Vietnam War, because it was no match for pretty much any other tank, because up in like the Indo-Pakistan War,
where India and Pakistan went at it over the fate of Bangladesh.
Pakistan
in the East.
used M48 Pattons, and India used British Centurions, and the Pattons were just getting knocked out left and right. And I'm not the biggest when it comes to aircraft, though I will say that during the war, America used the F-4 Phantom fighter, which during the Vietnam War were going up against, what was it, MiG...
MiG-15? No.
I think it was
MiG-22s.
Unlike most American fighters before, it did not have any guns like MGs or autocannons. It relied heavily on new missile technology, which these first generation air-to-air missiles were faulty, and so
Sortie rates.
Its kill ratios were just not good at all, and they were up against MiG-22s, which were incredibly flawed aircrafts.
Terrible design. I mean, the MiG series of fighters are pathetic.
There was also something I want to talk about, punji sticks, real quick, which was one of the many types of Vietnamese traps that they used during the Vietnam War. There were two most common ways of using it, either the punji stick spiked ball of mud or the punji stick pit, which the pit was...
Honestly, I'm having a hard time deciding which one I would want to die from if I had to die from
I would just say shoot me! Just shoot me, okay? Because the punji sticks tended, more often than not, had human feces on the end of it. So... They were sharpened bamboo sticks that usually had human feces on the end of it, or maybe even animal feces, but more often than not was human. And the punchy stick pits were pits that were dug out, and then they were covered over with sticks and leaves to where it looked like it was just ground. And then when you step there, you would fall in and die, get impaled by these sticks.
And the feces would cause mass infections across the body.
Mm-hmm. And the punchy stick balls were
terrifying.
They would be hung up in a tree where you couldn't see them, and it was a ball of mud with punchy sticks sticking out of it. And they would have a trip wire, and once the wire was tripped, the ball would come swinging down the path that you were walking. It basically shows you what kind of guerrilla warfare they were up against in the jungle.
It was the one type of war, for surprise, that the United States military was not prepared for.
So
we could handle island hopping stuff, and we couldn't handle jungle. Damn.
Yeah. Anyway,
on to the next one.
And number 8 is
the Russo-Turkish Wars, and primarily what we will be covering as a reference, because there have been multiple ones spanning back all the way to the 1600s. Russia had a fun time kicking around the Ottomans. Just saying. The Turks, just saying. We will be focusing on the 1887 to 1878 war. In this one, Russia gained a lot of liberation for the people of the Balkans that were under the thumb of the Ottomans. The Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Serbians, the people of Montenegro, and even earlier with the Greeks, supporting the Greek in the Greek Civil War the Greek War for Independence. And of course, the Ottomans, called the sick man of Europe, were just slowly losing the empire that they had since forever. They were slowly losing it to the Russians. And of course, also Austria intervened and came in to help with Bosnia, seizing control of it from the Ottomans as well. Basically, as this went on, the Russians also attacked. The Russians attacked in two areas. The Russians struck down out of Russia into Romania and swung down in order to liberate the Bulgars, or people of Bulgaria. They also struck out into the Caucasus.
Weapons. I'm someone who, when it comes to firearms, I mostly specialize in more modern 20th century, and though late 19th century is kind of up my alley, and that's what this is. So you have, of course, much older weapons like flintlock rifles, or possibly even muskets, like the M16 Russian. I can't pronounce that.
What is it spelling? KRNK. Krinka. Or
something like that, and
to all Russian people.
Yeah, that is from looking at the end of the weapon. It's the one on the bottom. It is a flintlock rifle, and it has its own bayonet, like a lot of those old weapons would.
Mm-hmm.
And you also, in the middle, you have the M1866 Winchester 44 carbine, which
That's caliber, not carbine.
44 caliber. Sorry.
And there were
probably carbine versions of it.
Yeah, true, but that's not a carbine version. That's a full-blown rifle version.
Lever-action rifles were pretty common in the mid to late 1800s, but of course, as the 20th century rolled around, bolt-action rifles would take the norm as the mainstay. Though Russia, even into World War I, would still be using lever-action rifles like the Winchester M1895. They would use it in pretty good numbers.
Though they did have their own, they did substitute, but they did have their own
bolt-action rifle, the Mosin Nagant, which we'll get into probably a little later.
Yeah.
And you also have a Turkish weapon, the M1874 Peabody Martini, or as many people who play Battlefield 1 would know it, the Martini Henry, which is a single-shot weapon that was used
by the Ottoman Empire.
That was used by the Ottoman Empire and was even used in pretty good quantity. It was actually used in pretty good quantities in World War I, surprisingly.
Well, that definitely is one reason why the Russians were able to do so well. The Russians knew how to counteract this, and because the Turks attempted an invasion of Russia in World War I, actually, and got their butts handed to them on a silver platter due to the winter. They were idiots for trying to march through the Caucasus Mountains in winter. The 1841 needle gun was a Prussian bolt-action rifle. It was a one-shot weapon, meaning that every time you load a round, you had to fire that before you could reload. But it was a breech-loaded round, and it was a bolt-action, meaning you could lay down to fire, meaning that you didn't have to stand up, you didn't have to worry about changing your firing position in order to cock a handle. You just had to unlock a bolt. Now, was it completely reliable? No, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. Now, let's get moving on. Number 7.
Oh dear God, this is the 100 Years' War.
Vive la France! To any French people out there, pardonnez-moi. Pardon, monsieur, madame, please. Alright, so the 100 Years' War is... Okay, first off, to clear up a misconception, no, the 100 Years' War is not a single war that lasted over 100 years. It is actually a series of about 4 separate time spans where the English and the French just went at it for a couple decades and they broke it off. But it lasted a little over 112 years. It lasted a little over 100 years by about 12 years. Basically what this was basically the dukes of medieval Europe just going at it full, no holds barred, no hold bars, fight to the death. This was basically the age of the knight and the age of the longbow. Many times, the English archers would often defeat French knights charging up hills. But, of course, the French knights also would defeat any English... of course, the French army was capable of defending their empire, was capable of defending France against a lot of threats, protecting Paris, protecting Caen, protecting a lot of other major cities across France. Now, there is one iconic character who the Catholic Church has portrayed, who has declared the patron saint of France. Madame, the Lady of France herself, Joan of Arc. This young girl was incredible. The Maid of Orleans, as they called her. The Maid of Orleans. She not only had a great intuition, but it was her intervention in the darkest days of the war, that came to save France and actually helped the Dauphin, or the prince, the crown prince, ascend to the throne and claim the crown for France, allowing France to fight off the English. And on top of that, many people also have a misconception. Shadiversity has covered this a lot, just saying that out there. Love that guy. He has often said that there's a huge misconception that plate armor is heavier than chain armor. No. When it comes to full-body articulated plate armor, like in the high Middle Ages, what that actually is it's not that heavy. People can rock climb in that thing, in that stuff. It's not easy, but they can. And the reason why is because the weight is spread out all over your body, and you can maneuver, you can move in so many ways. You can do jumping jacks. You can do body flips if you try. It's not going
to do parkour.
You could try to do parkour in that thing, and you can, but the catch is, it's 45 pounds. Usually most of the armor weight, most suits back then that weren't overly fanciful, that kind of suit of armor would typically weigh about 45 pounds or maybe a little lighter. Basically, that armor, it's 45 pounds spread all over your body. Meaning you're not only getting a little bit of a workout, but you can maneuver. It's not as heavy as people think. And so going back also with Joan of Arc, just to cover this up real quick, Joan of Arc also wielded a legendary sword. Now, it wasn't like Excalibur or anything, but it was a sword that belonged to a famous monarch.
It was no King Arthur pulling out of the stone.
No. It wasn't anything like that, like the sword in the stone type of thing. No. This sword was the sword of the Holy Roman Emperor, the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne. With this final slide, you see the progression of the war. In fact, in the third stage there, you see that France is on the ropes, and that's when Joan of Arc makes her appearance after the siege of Orleans. Basically, by this point, the English are being driven back, and France is beginning to reclaim its power. And in the last one, France has managed to drive the English out, and their holdings have failed. But also, the last segment of the war ended in 1453. The catch is, at that same time in Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Turks conquered the last holdout of the old Roman Empire. The eastern capital, Constantinople.
Anyway, moving on to the weapons, of course, it was the late medieval ages, so siege warfare was well developed, and you had things like siege towers and battering rams, which were common use, and great walled castles.
Now, at this time, stone castles were very common, but unlike what most people think, that was not the norm throughout the whole Middle Ages. In fact, for most of the Middle Ages, up until about the year 1000, when stone things started coming around, most of the castles were motte and bailey, meaning they had a stone base, but the palisades, the upper part of the walls, were made of wood.
There were large logs that were spiked on top, like you would see from some wooden forts from, like, the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, like the colonial period.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
So that just paints a picture of what you would see.
But by the time of the 100 Years' War, or by the time of Joan of Arc at least, most of the castles are made of stone, or most of them are beginning to turn into stone, going from wood. So in this picture, what we see here is like a glorified drama of it. You have siege towers, you have siege ladders, you have scaling bits.
I think this is actually, you see ballistas in the background on top, and like flaming fireballs being shot from them, which is kind of cool.
That's probably just like a bundle of straw with pitch and tar and lit on fire.
Yeah.
That they chucked out, because that was common back in the day, along with throwing dead, diseased cows over the walls to spread the plague.
Mm-hmm. And Yeah, and you also see off to the left, you see what looks like a small mobile home. It's actually a battering ram, because the battering ram would be in there on the other side.
Oh yeah, and also over here, just above that on the hill, this large siege ramp where they have trebuchets trying to hurl stuff over into the castle walls.
Oh yeah, trebuchets, not ballistas. What was I saying?
Ballistas actually were.
I think that's a ballista right there. Do you see it? Right
Yeah,
at the bottom.
yeah, that does seem that. I think that might be one that, or it's just an archer shield, and that's just a crossbowman.
Could be. Yeah, and then of course gunpowder came into its own around the late Middle Ages and was heavily utilized in small mobile cannons like Joan of Arc. She used small cannons for getting through walls, but
Especially when she came to save the city of Orleans during the siege. The English had a fort that was part of the main gate under their control. So what she did was she had her cannons blow out some of the gates and knock down some of the walls, so that way her troops could get in and take it.
Though the cannons she normally used were much smaller. They were like a quarter the height of the average male. So
They literally were
here
like
in
low
this
to the
picture,
ground. They were low to the ground.
very low to the ground. But this one I show a massive siege bombard, which is probably just as tall as the average modern human male.
And the catch is with this thing, if you would for a quick second, picture something about almost 5 times the size of that thing, and you have the bombards that took out the walls of Constantinople. Those things were the biggest guns ever made, other than later on in the 20th century.
And also, wasn't it some sort of large siege bombard that was Humpty Dumpty?
Yes, actually. It was a large cannon that they had mounted on a wall, and when it fired, it jumped off the wall.
Yeah, so
And
little known
it
fact,
broke.
Humpty Dumpty
Was not an egg.
Today, the story has become about
An
an egg that fell off the wall, Humpty Dumpty. But back originally, it originated from a cannon that it was so massive, and when it shot, it fell off the wall and broke. And the pieces were so heavy, the king's horses and men couldn't put it together again.
Basically meaning they couldn't pick it up in order to try to get the cannon barrel on a new chassis to try to hold the thing back up on top of the wall.
it was.
And I can imagine that this would definitely be something smaller, similar to what they would have probably used back in the day.
The cannon I'm showing right here is very small compared to some of the larger ones.
This is basically an average siege bombard that would have been used back in the Renaissance or the High Middle Ages.
I would say it would, the High Middle Ages.
And also the later Renaissance, basically like when the Renaissance began, like the late 1600s, early 1700s, before more modern guns started coming into their own.
Of course, cannons would very quickly lead to hand cannons very late in the Middle Ages. The one I'm showing right here is probably one of the most popular types. This
Doubled as a club.
This, the little spike on the bottom was a handle, but it could also be used as a club after being fired. And this
You wouldn't want that thing
and
flying
this
to the back of your
was
skull.
back in the day. This was state of the art, and it was very simplistic. You would have a small tube, which you would put the powder and you would put the charge and the round in, and then you would have a hole in the top where you would place a match. And of course, I could go on with the evolution of how this turned to matchlocks, then flintlocks, wheel locks, all that stuff, but I'm not going to.
Would be too much for time constraints.
Hand cannons, they weren't necessarily the most practical, though they would
Sometimes
lead the
they
way.
would blow up.
Yeah, but they would lead the way forward for later firearms technology. And number 6 is
The 7 Years' War, or, as it's called here in America, the French and Indian War. This war got started in the Americas, believe it or not, by George Washington, when he killed a French diplomat. By accident! So the war started in America, and then it spilled over into Europe, and it escalated out of control there when Prussia got involved. Because Frederick the Great had taken Silesia from Maria Theresa of Austria. Maria Theresa wanted it back. She allied herself with Empress Elizabeth of Russia, the Swedes, and the French. And the French, because they were at odds with the English, fought the Prussians, who had made an alliance with the English. So, King Frederick Wilhelm II, also known to history as simply Frederick the Great, King Frederick II, His name wasn't Frederick Wilhelm. It was Frederick. It was just Frederick. Basically, as you can see by this image, had one of the most imposing armies ever. Prussia was one of the most feared states in all of Europe for a very good reason. And if you know anything about Prussia, you know Voltaire's old adage, where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. Basically, the Prussian army was the central part of Prussian life. And Prussia basically was on the ropes when Russia was involved in the war. But then when Elizabeth the Empress died, Peter II ascended to the throne. And he eventually drew Russia out of the war. And Catherine the Great took his place. After he was forced to abdicate and then eventually died later in mysterious circumstances. But Maria Theresa, after Russia fell out of the conflict and France couldn't do squat to help them, basically got her butt handed to her on a silver platter by the Prussians again. And then it only just went downhill from there. Because France started losing all over. In India, in the Caribbean, in North America, in Europe. And Britain was owning all of their stuff. And the Swedes basically did nothing. They declared war and then dropped out a year later. Because they just didn't want to lose any more territory. They had lost a lot in the Great Northern War against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Denmark-Norway, and Peter the Great of Russia. This is what Austrian troops look like. You can see that they are pretty pathetic with that outfit, seriously. And the British. And the British did have Native American allies. See, the funny thing is most people get the idea, like when people think of Indians, they think of all Northern Indians being the same. No, there were multiple different tribes in the North. The ones that the French were allied with were the Huron. The ones that Lake Huron gets its name from. But what the English had as allies were the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, or as their people are actually called, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Long House. Having watched something on the foundation of the Iroquois Confederation, I actually know that their name is actually the Haudenosaunee. And the funny thing is, the English. This is especially true with the Last of the Mohicans movie. The catch is that in that film, there's an English battalion escorting the daughters of a Scottish officer holding a fort near Lake Champlain in the north that the French and Indians are besieging. Well, the catch is that this Native American scout who claims he's a Mohawk offers to be their guide. He's a Huron, and the English don't know, but the French do. The 7 Years' War really concluded where things basically had started. It ended the way it had started, with everything set the way it was started, only France was much weaker, Austria had its butt handed to it, Russia was beginning an entire era of neutrality, Sweden pretty much stayed out of the fighting altogether, Portugal really didn't do much. I'm not sure about their involvement in the war. Probably just collaborate with the British to hold on to their African holdings. And Prussia kicked the crap out of everybody. And the British, in the meantime, gained pretty much almost all of New France and gained a massive foothold against the French in the Caribbean and in India.
So the weapons used were mostly flintlock muskets, and also probably there were also probably rifles, because there were rifles used.
The Prussian army actually had whole entire regiments of troops that were called Jagers. Jagers were riflemen. Mm-hmm. These guys were trained their whole life from the moment that they joined the army to use nothing but the rifle, as opposed to the regulars who used the musket. Mm-hmm. Now, no other nation in the world had this. Not the Russians, not the British, not the French, not the Austrians, not the Portuguese, not the Swedes. And the rifle was used very effectively by English colonists against the French and Indians during the French and Indian War over in America.
Mm-hmm. And as you can see, I have 4 different flintlock firearms here. As you can see, the one on the bottom is a 3-band musket with its own bayonet. The one above it is a 2-band musket. Of course, these are all flintlock. 2-band musket with its own bayonet, and then The one right above that is
A Prussian musket because it has no bands.
it has no bands. And as you can see, they also put the dates next to them. The one on the bottom, 1754, and then one above it's 1745, 1722. Is the one right above that. Then also you have the one at the very top from 1705, and it's actually a rifle, as you can tell by the end of the gun. Not actually designed to have a bayonet, though. As you can see, they actually do have a bayonet for it, which is one that would be stuck in the barrel after fire, just in case.
Yep. Basically, what early bayonets that were actually invented in France were designed to do was that you would fire your musket, and then you would fix the bayonet at the end of the barrel, plugging the hole of the barrel, and you would use it essentially like a giant spear.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what this rifle is doing, although I don't understand why. As with a rifle, you would want to stay out of sight and kill a high important target.
And also, mortars were also were actually, from what I've seen and read, mortars were actually were very commonplace in the war, and they were used to pretty great effect. And from what from almost any page I can find about weapons on the 7 Years' War, mortars is on like each of them. So that would suggest, I haven't done too much research, but that would suggest that they were used quite often during the war. Do you have anything to put on that?
Well, definitely for the French forces attempting to take the northern forts that the English had built along the border with Canada and the colonies.
In Europe, they were definitely used when a town came under siege. Because what these things would be able to do is fire over old walls that were still standing, and you could modify mortars to become what the Germans, what the Prussians and the Austrians would call howitzers or howitzers, which were designed to actually impact. They couldn't elevate as high, but what they would do is they would be medium-range weapons that could fire up onto the defenses and take out defenders, trying to take out the garrison as opposed to attack the town. Number 5
is the American War for Independence.
Okay, so with this one, everybody pretty much knows a lot of the history of it, but the image that you see here is actually a famous painting of George Washington at Valley Forge. And the catch is that Valley Forge gets a lot of credit, but that wasn't actually the worst winter the American Army ever suffered. The worst was the winter that came after this. 1778 to 1779, when they were stuck at Morristown, New Jersey. The reason why this was bad at Valley Forge was because that they were low on supplies. Morristown, it was the cold. The temperature hovered around freezing as a high, meaning it hovered around 0 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically, the French and Indian War actually fed right into this. Because after the war, Britain suffered horribly from debt and a lot of other problems. So what happened was, the British started imposing taxes on the colonists without their representation in Parliament, without any kind of consent on their part. And the British had treated the colonists like equals for the most part. But the thing is that the British had expected the colonists to pay their fair share. Well, the colonists didn't get a say in the matter. And they thought they had paid their fair share. They didn't realize that the war was fought elsewhere. In India, in the Caribbean, and in Europe. They didn't realize it was almost a global war between the colonial powers and the major powers of Europe. But of course, going back to this, the British also made it even worse by sending soldiers. They sent troops to put down any kind of tension. And it only got worse with the Boston Massacre. Now, I'm not going to go into all details, but I will cover the Boston Massacre real quick. The Boston Massacre is a very, very confusing event because the portrayal that we have by Paul Revere is completely false. That was pure propaganda. But you see, the catch is that with this event that happened in Boston, what happened was that there was a guardsman at the side of a house. Local American patriots came out. Some of the disgruntled colonists came out and started harassing the man. He yelled out a command that called for reinforcements to help him get out. Call out the main guard. An officer and at least 8 other soldiers came out to support him. They got stuck behind a larger mob that followed them. And there's a number of reasons what could have happened. Some say that a British soldier got hit in the head with a club and that he returned fire, and then all the other soldiers just started firing into the crowd at will. Some say that a building had caught fire down the street, and a man came running down yelling, "Fire! Fire!" And the British soldiers, hearing that command, thought it was an order from their officer. At either rate, it was a disaster that shouldn't have happened. But what happened afterwards was that Samuel Adams and John Adams, actually gave a fair trial and a fair defense to the British officers responsible for the massacre. Eventually, the disgruntled led to war. And after years of losing more than winning, we won our independence. We may have lost most of the battles, but we won the war. And this map you see here shows the map, the pre-war boundaries by 1775. The yellow is the British, the red, because there's a red down there, there's a red right here, that's Haiti, that's French. And then you have the green is the Russians, then you have the purple is the Spanish, and the pink is the United States. The striped territory is disputed. But going off of this, you see that before it, Britain controlled most of the eastern side of the continent, while Spain controlled most of the west. After the war, by 1783, when the peace treaty was finally signed, and Britain finally recognized the colonies as an independent republic, and not part of their empire, the United States gained all the territory up to the Mississippi River. This was claimed by both Spain and the U.S., and these territories were both claimed by Spain and by the U.S. and Britain. This was both claimed by Spain and Russia, which is what became part of current-day British Columbia and also the state of Washington, the states of Washington and Oregon.
And of course, weapons. And of course, it's common knowledge in the media today. They'll talk about how around this time there were a lot of muskets used. And as you can see, the two on the top are muskets. You have the Char Lever,
Set model 1777.
Which is the one on the very top. And
that is the French musket.
And then the one right below it is actually British. It is the Brown Bess.
This British firearm actually served them for a long time, up until it was replaced by the Enfield rifle.
And the rest
Fun fact.
And the last four long weapons you can see are, I believe, all American rifles.
The first one on top, underneath the Brown Bess, is the Pennsylvania long rifle. The one underneath that is the flintlock version of the Kentucky rifle.
And then you also have
percussion caps.
And then the two last ones are percussion caps.
Both are Kentucky.
And of course, rifles came into their own in combat around this time, where America would start using rifle squads and even snipers, which I'll get into in a sec. And you can also see single-shot pistols. Good
luck hitting anything with those things.
Well,
they had the accuracy of nothing because they couldn't hit anything.
It was usually something just carried by officers, and they would carry like two or more.
Pirates would carry,
Pirates would carry like 8 of them on their 8 or 10.
They'd have like
at least your stereotypical one. It's just like, it's kind of like the Reaper from Overwatch. He just throws away his shotguns and gets out new ones.
Gotta love that.
And so, of course, the one on the left is a flintlock, and the one on the right is a percussion cap.
Yes.
And it was around this time that percussion caps came into their own. And by the 1800s, it was pretty much the standard. And
flintlocks had pretty much been phased out by that point.
Yeah. And of course, here I also have another, I'm pretty sure this is another Pennsylvania rifle flintlock.
And the catch is the way you could tell, there are several ways you could tell it's a rifle. The ending of the barrel shows that it has a much more, not perfectly round barrel, and it also has this brass fitting here. Plus, if you look, it has a much different design for the stock, where a rifleman can lay down and have his head right here to where he can look down those iron sights and keep an accurate beat on his target, so that way he always gets the shot off dead accurate every time.
Speaking of which, this image right here is a sniper from the American War for Independence. Like I said, rifle squads became a thing, and they would basically kind of get around behind the lines and just kind of cause disruption. And then snipers would also do the same. They would send out a group of 2 or 3 of these guys, and they would work together in tangent. One would get up in a tree, and the rest would keep, and I think the others would keep a lookout on the ground. They, like in most video games, you wouldn't just pick off anyone you see. You would try and pick off a high-value target.
In modern war, what a sniper is taught to aim for is either the machine gunner, the grenadier, the medic, or the commanding officer. And the reason why is that if you take out any of those support or command structures, their structure for the individual rifleman, the average guy who doesn't have the grenades, who doesn't have the automatic, the guy who doesn't have the machine gun, the guy who isn't in charge, the guy who doesn't have the medical experience, if you take out, he's now, first of all, he doesn't have any leadership capabilities. Second of all, he doesn't have any support capabilities. He's screwed. That's the benefit of a marksman.
It was one of Daniel Morgan's best. It was actually his best sniper that he sent forward to take out a British officer who
was rallying the British troops at Bemis Heights at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 in upstate New York.
And he actually, basically, he got up in a tree and he loaded his first shot, and it was more of a ranging shot. It was just to kind of get a feel for how he's going to shoot. And then the second one,
he missed.
He missed, but you could tell that it was said that the officer flinched like it had gone right past him. And then the third and final one hit him right in the gut, and he had a big breakfast that day. It was said he had a big breakfast that day, so he didn't stand a chance, and he died while still on his horse.
And with that, the British lost hope and eventually were retreated, forcing General Johnny Burgoyne, or Gentleman Johnny as they called him, Gentleman Burgoyne, one of the three main British commanders in America, to surrender to General Horatio Gates. And Gates stole the credit from Morgan and from Benedict Arnold, the man who would eventually become the infamous traitor of the Revolution. And the catch is Benedict Arnold was also at Bemis Heights. He gets more credit than Morgan. Morgan's marksman pulled off that shot, but Benedict Arnold was the one that rallied the American forces, taking a bullet in his leg again. Mind you, this was the second injury in that same leg that he went into battle like that. And he basically won. He won the day for them because he rallied his forces. Yeah,
and that also brings on the thing of by the time of the Civil War, it was kind of there were some high-ranking officers that would actually wear private clothing. They would actually wear the clothing of privates because so that they could actually avoid
drawing a beat on them.
Drawing a beat from a sniper. Because by the American Civil War, there were actually sniper-designated weapons. Believe it or not, they had very thick metal barrels, and just long scopes that spanned the length of the rifle.
Which definitely did pave the way for modern sniper rifles.
And it was just weird. Of course, artillery was also a pretty common thing.
The Battle of Yorktown, that was a siege.
And probably one of the most popular and most well-known piece of American artillery was the American 6-pounder, which was typically made out of brass, copper, or bronze. And it was typically made from church bells and statues that were melted down and put into molds and would be used
Despite what people think, it wasn't the statue that they pulled down in 1776 in New York of King George III, that actually was made into ammunition.
No.
That wasn't made into cannons. But church bells and other things like that, and alarm bells and all that, that was used to make cannons, because those are usually made of bronze.
Well, I would think there would be some other statues that would probably be melted down and used into cannons. I would think somewhere out there.
Yeah.
And just the American 6-pounder is a pretty iconic-looking cannon. Even for people who are not really into war, you could tell that it's kind of all over the place, especially if you go to, like, a museum that talks about the Revolutionary War. And, of course, technological innovation would begin to start...
Knows no bounds.
Around the 1800s is when weaponry and technology would start to kick up.
But this
A notch.
was an all-American invention. The first true combat submarine.
The Turtle, which was very interesting. It
Now, it
basically
wasn't successful in its first mission. Its only mission. It was to sink the British flagship of the blockade block of New York, the HMS Eagle, which, by the way, housed 64 cannon. 32 guns either side of her decks.
cannons.
Yes. And the catch is, she was so big, she weighed as much as a small modern aircraft carrier.
And of course, the Turtle was basically, as you can see in this picture, a large wooden barrel almost, with of course metal pieces and you can see glass windows, so you can see out, and you can actually see in the frontmost window facing towards you a man's face if you look closely.
Oh yeah, and the catch is that the propeller you see on pointing up, that was to keep the thing going down. The propeller in front was to help it go forward.
Mm-hmm.
And the big black thing on the back, that's not concrete, that's actually a keg of powder.
Mm-hmm.
What that would do is that they were supposed to screw a hole into the Eagle, and this screw would attach the would attach the bomb, and as the Eagle got away, as the Turtle got away, the bomb would go off, taking the Eagle with it. Essentially, the first ever torpedo attack in submarine history.
Though of course it was of course for a time, of course compared to what we have today in submarine technology, it was primitive. It was pedal powered, and you had to surface quite often to open up a tube so you could get air.
And it did not succeed in its mission. It did not sink the Eagle, because what happened was that the screw failed to hold onto the wood. They couldn't screw into the wood all the way. They actually did get it to stick, but then the screw fell out and the bomb just floated down the Hudson River, where it goes off on its own, harming no one. But the Turtle was not captured. They actually did save it. They hauled it off, and they basically, I think they scrapped it at some point.
Well, but of course, like most first, it may not always be successful.
But it did point the way to future designs, and it proves that America invented the submarine.
Number 4 is
The Napoleonic Wars. Okay, so this image you see here is pretty much nothing less Napoleon being crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, and even crowning his own empress. You see, the catch is that Napoleon wasn't even crowned by the Pope. He literally took the crown, he was literally kneeling before the Pope, and the Pope had the crown in his hand, and Napoleon then rose, took the crown from the Pope's hands, and placed it on his own head. And then he also did the same for his empress, allowing the Pope to take a back seat. Essentially saying, I don't need your church. I am the emperor. He basically declared himself Holy Roman Emperor. In fact, the crown you see him wearing is the traditional leaf crown of a Roman emperor. That's the thing, is that he was drawing a lot from Rome. He wanted to restore a Rome to Europe, like a lot of monarchs did. Rome was the pinnacle of civilization for a long time, up until America and the British. Here we have the combat, which was traditional volley style, meaning that you would have your troops packed into dense formations and fire. Now, the French unfortunately pulled off a bit of a blunder with this. They had their troops engage in column lines, meaning that their troops could only fire the front 2 ranks safely, unless the front 2 ranks kneeled. Then you could have the first 4 ranks fire safely. The first 2 ranks would fire, and the 3rd and 4th ranks would fire standing up, whereas the first 2 would be kneeling. The problem is, that didn't work as opposed to the British line, where every gun was brought to bear. This is the crème de la crème of the French army at the time. The elite Imperial Guard. And not just that, the old guard. The older men of this fight. And in fact, you see the flag flying? That is the famous Eagle Standard of the Imperial Guard. They are the pinnacle of the French. Here you have a map of the French Empire under Napoleon at its height, dominating and completely removing the Holy Roman Empire and any remnants that were left of it. The Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians were on the ropes. Denmark and Sweden were pretty much staying out of the fight.
And the Ottomans were just sitting back and wondering who's going to win this fight, and the British were basically dominating the waves, while Napoleon was focused more on land rather than at sea.
And probably one of the most common used throughout the entire war was the Charlevert Model 1777 musket.
Every Frenchman was armed with one.
It's probably one of the most well-known muskets in all of history. A very commonly well-known musket.
Every soldier in the Grande Armée of France was equipped with one.
I mean, heck, the American War for Independence, on that list of weapons that we showed earlier at number 5, the Charlevert musket was on there because even American soldiers were equipped with them. That's how commonplace it was.
And the French army had them too, when the French came to assist us at Yorktown.
And, of course, cannons were also a part of this, like, of course.
Early renditions of the Iron Parrot gun, before they became rifled.
As you can see here.
Back in Napoleon predominantly used a smoothbore 8-pound cannon, which was very effective. And Napoleon actually served a philosophy of basically baiting your enemy into attacking you and then smashing them with overwhelming force before they really because they would think you have a weaker force, but then you would smash them with overwhelming force. And he believed that any cavalry and artillery units could overwhelm any infantry formation. And at the Battle of Austerlitz, the entire Austrian army was wiped out. 1/3 of the Russian army was wiped out, and it forced the Russian Tsar, the grandson of Catherine the Great, mind you, to say that we are babies in the hands of a giant.
The American War for Independence, they would usually put gravel and nails and other sharp metal rusted things down it and
bits
shoot
of
it
metal,
up.
bits of metal.
But in the Napoleonic War, they had something much more official, which was pretty much a small fabric sack filled with smaller metal balls, and it would shoot out like a shotgun. Basically, being
grape shot.
Yeah, grape shot.
As opposed to what the Americans created, which was basically a scatter shot, which was less effective.
What? Less effective. Well, it's much harder to deal with medically. So, because it's usually like pieces of rusted metal, which
nails, gravel, bits of chain, rusted metal.
Yeah.
Basically anything that could fit down the barrel that was broken. Honorable mentions.
Yep, here's our honorable mentions, and the first one is the Spanish-American War.
This right here is a picture of U.S. battleships going toe-to-toe with the Spanish Navy, which was basically a pile of crap. Basically, Spain up to this point was basically as a global empire was basically on its deathbed, and was basically about to lose the last of its territory to USA. All that it had left was the colony. After this was just the islands off the coast of Mexico. Not Mexico. Morocco. My bad. Wrong continent. But basically, what happened was that we sent an envoy down to. We basically were feeling a little bit imperialistic and basically blamed the Maine on them. When the Maine blew up because there was a mishap with a shell in one of her magazines that blew up, and the explosion traveled from both ends of the ship down the ammunition access corridor, and both magazines exploded, taking the ship into basically blowing the ship in half.
And did everyone die on board?
Not a single soul survived.
Dang.
All 350 Marines and all sailors, all hands lost. Okay, so the map here shows of the United States. Eventually, we beat the crap out of them. Spain tried and attempted an relief.
No, this is Cuba.
Yeah.
This is not. You said United States.
Well, no, the U.S. Our invasion plans.
I know, but that all you see is Florida up there. So.
Yeah, well, we basically launched invasion forces down and invaded Cuba. We also took Puerto Rico and also launched invasions at the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines. We laid hold of the Philippines up until 1946 when we granted them the right of independence as an independent country. And also, we kind of held on to... We basically helped Cuba become free and independent until Castro took over.
Moving on to the weapons. I have two weapons right here. The one on the bottom is a Krag Jorgensen American bolt-action rifle with its... And you can also see a bayonet for it right below it.
The catch is that rifle did not perform well in Spain, which eventually led to us getting the 1903 Springfield, which was a Mauser pattern rifle.
Yeah. Because The Craig Jorgensen was, when it was first introduced, it was pretty good, but when
By the time America went up against Spain with it, we found out how outclassed we were.
yeah, and so in 1903 the Springfield will come along. We'll probably get more in detail about that later. So anyway, let's move on to our next honorable mention.
The Mexican War. Comment on the Mexican War was very similar to that of the War of 1812, and for that of the American Revolution. Very linear style war, and what it led to was eventually the seizure of Texas and the independence of Texas and California, which eventually opted to join the United States as territories or unions. So basically, this war was the result of, well, despite what leftist SJWs would say, just throwing this out there, they would say that it was America illegally stealing land from Mexico, when in fact it wasn't. Mexico was allowing American immigrants to pass through into a part of Texas. These Americans then called themselves Texans and wanted to become independent, because Mexico was not offering them any freedom. So, what do? They rebel. Mexico sends an army up north and bashes them down. Former U.S. representative, mind you, a congressman, Davy Crockett, gets killed along with Sam Houston, an American war hero, and American entrepreneur James Bowie. All of them get killed at the Alamo. So, what does America remember? Remember the Alamo. We march in and help the Texans regain their independence, give them more land, as outlined by the brown on the map from the yellow, and also they secede California to us. And eventually, Texas joins the United States as a full-blown American territory and state.
The War of 1812.
This war is very iconic, to say the least, because this is where America gets its famous national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, written by a lawyer on a neutral ship watching the British bombardment of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. This was written by Francis Scott Key. And of course, there's also the famous USS Constitution, or Old Ironsides, as she was called, a frigate. She basically had a copper-plated hull that enabled her to bounce off cannonballs, and she managed to win a fight with a British frigate of equal firepower. The funny thing is that while America's army did not do well throughout most of the war, America's fledgling navy actually did good enough against the British Navy to get them to back off.
And as you can see in this picture, you can see full broadside and both ships covered in clouds of smoke.
But you can clearly see that the British vessel is the one that's getting completely torn apart as one of its rear masts has fallen over. So with this map, you see that along the Canadian border, there's a lot of advances by both British and American forces. It didn't really get far. American forces basically go from Huntersville to Horseshoe Bend, then from Fort Jackson to Pensacola, and then from Pensacola to New Orleans. And of course the British attempted an invasion of the capital. They did succeed in taking the capital, but then guess what happened to prevent them from destroying the capital completely? A tornado came out of nowhere and actually swept the British away. Drove the British out of Washington, D.C.
Weapons were pretty much almost the same to the weapons used in the American War for Independence, though percussion cap weapons were a little more commonplace, and I think breech loading weapons were just starting to become a thing, but I don't think it would have been really used at all. But it was pretty much almost exactly the same to the weapons used, because
flintlock muskets, flintlock rifles,
percussion cap weapons. Yeah, because the wars were back to back. The technology was pretty much the same. There were a couple, of course, things that were just coming into their own in the Revolutionary War, like percussion caps, were now more commonplace.
The Crimean War. This war is what led to the rise of one of the great men that you see on the screen here, Tsar Alexander II. He was hailed as the liberator. He was the one that freed Russia from serfdom. He was czar during the American Civil War and actually declared Russia for the Union. Basically, that it would not support the Confederacy. The war was primarily fought in the peninsula of Crimea because the Kingdom of Sardinia and Piedmont in northern Italy, and the French and the British empires, along with the Ottomans, all joined forces and invaded Crimea. And essentially, after the siege of Sevastopol, the Russian naval port there, the Russians eventually were forced out of Crimea and were forced to surrender. And it was a humiliating peace. And this map here shows that the Allied attacks basically broke the Russians at the Battle of Balaclava, and then later at the siege of Sevastopol. And the Russians had initially attacked had initially pushed into Moldova and Wallachia, also attacked and broke the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Sinope.
Right here I have a percussion cap 1853 Enfield rifle. As you can see, it's a 3-band rifle, and this is actually one of the later rifles that was intended to have a bayonet attached to it, as evident by the end. And moving on to our last one, the Cold War.
This was basically not much of an actual war. More of just a massive stare down with nuclear weapons. This is basically Russia and the US going, okay, we both have nuclear weapons, we don't really want to use them because we know that if we do, it's going to be mass genocide across the planet and it'll be the end of everything we know and love. And of course, we both have opposite polarities because we believe that capitalism is an evil spawn of Satan, and of course, you think that communism is an evil spawn of Satan. So pretty much, we're pretty much stuck in an impasse. The Tsar Bomba, in case you're wondering, was the largest bomb that ever existed. It was a 58.3 megaton thermonuclear bomb, the largest bomb that ever existed. In fact, it was so big that the initial spot where it detonated didn't even get radiated. The radiation went up so high into the atmosphere, it got carried off a couple hundred miles off and landed in the ocean.
Impressive.
Very impressive. But the Russians were forced to dismantle it in 1961 after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis as part of the deal that America wouldn't invade the U.S., America wouldn't invade Cuba, and Russia, and of course America removed its missiles from Turkey, and also Russia was forced to dismantle the only other Tsar bomba they ever built. They built 2. Anyway, so Russia was very militaristic, as you can see with this image. They have troops parading with moistened nagats, bayonets fixed, and parading down Red Square. They are the pride of Mother Russia, of the Soviet Union. And I am not communist. This is a Russian map that shows the divide between East and West. You have the Warsaw Defense Pact in the East under the thumb of the Soviet Union, and in the West, you have NATO.
And, of course, this war is probably more credited towards the technological innovation, because it lasted from the late 1950s to the late 1980s. It was
actually
incredible.
The 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, early 90s, I would say.
Yeah, 93 is when the Soviet Union fell apart.
So, late 1950s to early 90s, and in that time, we had things like stealth jets and fighters, like the one shown up on screen. I'm sorry that I cannot recall its name. You also had nuclear power submarines, and the world's largest submarine ever created, which is this one shown right here, which was built by the Soviet Union. It is absolutely massive.
Actually, to where there is actually very comfortable quarters and not tight bulkheads on the inside.
And it's like the span of several football fields, so it's incredible.
Russia, though, those things are very hard for them to maintain.
Also, in the 1950s, just as the Cold War was kicking off, helicopters came into their own. This one,
the Germans actually pulled off the first true helicopter in the 1940s and 30s.
And then there was also the R-1, which America made in the 1940s as well. Yeah. So America had their own 1940s. It wasn't actually used as far as I can tell, but Germany had their first operational helicopter.
That was used in World War II.
And then 1950s is when they were truly perfected, and
we had that one helicopter that everyone remembers from Smash, from the Korean War.
Yeah, it was a medical helicopter. There was also the Cayuse, which was also known as the Flying Egg. had a weird shaped cockpit. You can look it up.
Yeah.
And then you also have this one. This is probably the most iconic helicopter of the Vietnam War, which is
Most
the
iconic helicopter of all time, other than the Apache.
I mean, it's the Hewitt.
The Huey.
The Huey. Sorry, dang it. The Hewitt's the name of a Canadian machine gun from World War One. Anyway, then you also have a lot of very iconic tanks came from this period, like the British Centurion, the Russian T-54
/55.
That was actually a different variant.
Oh, okay.
The T-55 was actually an upgrade variant designed for nuclear warfare.
Holy crap.
Yeah. Then you also had in the early 1980s the M1 Abrams.
Late 70s, early 80s.
And of course, nuclear technology was advanced greatly throughout the entire war. It was known as a war where the U.S. and Russia were just pointing nukes at each other. And throughout the 1960s and 70s, ICBM nukes would be experimented with. It wasn't until the 1980s where they actually came up with successful designs. And you can see this picture right here is a pretty menacing-looking picture of an ICBM nuke in a missile silo.
And the catch is, though, while the Cold War itself never really got squared off, you see the catch is in 1948, the Russians actually did make a move against the U.S., the British, and the French with the Berlin blockade. All that happened was that we basically supplied the entire city by air for like a few months. And then, of course, in the 1950s, the Korean War. Then the 1960s and 70s, you have Vietnam. Then you got the rest of the Cold War through the 80s and the 90s, and then the conflicts in the Middle East, and then all that other crap.
Yep. But that is
Honorable mention.
That is all of our honorable mentions. Now let's move on to our top 3.
Number 3
is the American Civil War.
This is the bloodiest war in American history. This has claimed more lives than any other war that the U.S. has ever fought in terms of just American casualties, period. In World War II, we suffered around almost 300,000 casualties. In World War I, around 100,000. The Civil War are almost at least over 500,000. Over 500,000 to 600,000.
Well, because the only people that die were Americans.
Northern and Southern.
Yeah.
Yankee or Dixie. So this image you have here is of one of my favorite regiments, the 69th New York Regiment. This is an all-Irishman brigade. The flag you see there is actually the flag of an Irish rebellion against the British called the Harp of Erin. It is the flag of the 69th New York Irish Regiment. Good on ya, boys. Go forward for Ireland. This is of a picture of the Battle of the Battle of Antietam, I do believe, or some other battle. But it's actually an image called with a rebel yell. Because what this shows is, because this is actually a famous puzzle, an image that is actually a famous puzzle that got released around the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. So I think it might be Gettysburg. But basically, there's also a bit of a misconception that ties into with the next image. But real quick, sticking with this one real quick. The flag that you see the Confederates flying there right now, up front, in center, that is not the main flag of the Confederate States of America. That is actually a North Carolina battle regiment for the North Carolina, I think, 85th Regiment?
And it just seems to be really popular, and some people just end up mistaking it for the Confederate flag.
Yeah, it's become the Confederate flag for some reason. And the catch is, actually, if you look, I think that might be the Irish Regiment going up against them. No, wait. No, that's a Massachusetts regiment. That's a Massachusetts regiment. You can tell by the flag.
Yeah.
Because the 54th Massachusetts Color Division flew a flag similar to that. This is actually the flag of the Confederate States, called the Stars and Bars. 11 stars in a circle in a blue corner piece with 3 stars. With 3 stars. 3 bars, and you had 2 red and 1 white. This is the map. So all the blue is the Union states, or the northern states. So you had Oregon, Nevada, and California. Nevada was added after 1864 because that was the state that was admitted to the Union to help Lincoln. Basically, Lincoln cheated to get reelected. Not going to lie. But also, going on with this, the rest is... But one thing that they don't show here is actually that Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and also... same with West Virginia. West Virginia actually joined the Union in... during the Civil War in 1863. It actually broke away from Virginia and ceded back to the Union during the war. And Maryland and Delaware both were, along with Kentucky and Missouri, were basically border states. They were not for the Union. They were not for the they stayed with the Union, but they did not, and supplied troops to both sides, but basically did not openly declare themselves for the rebellion. Whereas the Confederates, you have the traditional 11 states: South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and finally North Carolina. North Carolina actually didn't want to secede from the Union, but they actually ended up contributing the most Confederate soldiers. The funny thing is that when the government actually officially documented this war, they didn't call it the Civil War. They called it the War of the Rebellion. One reason why: they did not want to lend legitimacy to the Confederate government. They did not want to lend legitimacy to the Confederacy, because if they did, it would mean recognizing them as a nation. And it would mean that foreign powers would have to intervene. And that's the last thing the federal government wanted.
The weapons are pretty iconic. Right here we have a 1855 Springfield percussion cap musket.
It's a musket, not a rifle.
Yes, but next we have, it looks similar, but this is a 1861 Springfield rifle, which pretty much exactly the same, but with a rifled barrel.
And the catch is, this was the mainstay of the armament of the Union Army. By the time of the Civil War, they barely ever used a musket. Most of the Union and Confederate armies were either armed with a Springfield rifle or an Enfield rifle.
And then a little later you would have like the Sharps rifles, which were easier to reload.
And even the Henry rifles.
And then you also have, of course, the mainstay sidearm, very iconic and popular, the Colt revolvers. The revolvers were... the most popular revolvers were the Colt single-action Army and Navy models from the early 1840s and late 1830s. And there were also the Baby Dragoons, the Root revolvers, the Wells Fargo. There were so many different Colt revolvers, though of course the most common were the Colt Army and Navy models. Of course, around this time, a doctor decided to invent a killing machine. Kind of ironic, but it is. James was it James?
Dr. Richard Gatling.
It was Dr. Richard Gatling invented the iconic Gatling gun, a hand-cranked rapid-fire weapon with.
It can't be truly classified as a machine gun, but it is rapid fire.
Well, because it doesn't have. It's not actually an automatic weapon, which that's what makes an actual machine gun. And these typically had anywhere from 6 to 8 barrels. And the early versions used paper cartridges, though these had the tendency to jam. Though around the middle of the war or later in the war, I don't know when.
Late 1863, early 1864, he had it down to where he could get it to use more modern cartridges, and it actually worked.
Yeah, metal cartridges, metallic cartridges. Though it was kind of expensive, so no armies really took interest in it, except for one. I think it was a regiment or something.
Yeah, there was a general who was often the joke and scorn of the Union Army named Benjamin Butler, and he was the laughingstock of the Union Army when they literally made chamber pots, aka early toilets, to have his face in.
Yep.
He basically was not well liked because he was somewhat of an incompetent buffoon. But one time where he did not show incompetence was when he bought 12 of those for $1,000 apiece. $12,000.
So a lot of money in today's standards.
Very, very a lot of money. But it was worth it. Those were deployed at Petersburg in Virginia against the Confederate Army. And the Confederates were gunned down like crazy. These weapons made conventional tactics look stupid.
Yeah.
Completely. Because the Confederates
new technology coming along, old tactics will eventually die. Probably one of the most iconic knives to come out around this period was the Bowie knife, or Bowie knife, however the frick you want to pronounce it. But it was not created by James Bowie. It was actually named after him, for he used a knife that was very similar to what most modern Bowie knives are.
His personal custom-made one.
Mm-hmm.
And later renditions in honor of his sacrifice at the Battle of the Alamo, where he died alongside Davy Crockett and James Houston,
and Sam Houston, my bad, not James, Sam Houston. He basically he had a knife similar to that, plus he had a large revolver type rifle where he had multiple barrels on a single rifle design. But the catch is, he died, same there with everybody else. But eventually, later on, they did create knives similar to the one that he used that day. And the catch is, those knives, some of those knife models were so big, you could throw them with very good accuracy.
Next, we also have here some ships, the Merrimack, which originally was known as the CSS Virginia.
Actually, no.
No,
Yeah.
it was originally known as the CSS Merrimack. Sorry,
The USS Merrimack.
but then its name was changed to the CSS Virginia.
When the yes, because the Merrimack was an abandoned, scuttled ship that was in Norfolk, Virginia. When the Confederates took that early in the war, they found the ship, pulled up a lot of railroad track, and recontributed all that iron track piece, iron rails, into armor plating for a new upper structure for the Merrimack, and renamed it the CSS Virginia.
Though, of course,
And
the
unfortunately-
Union, of course, not wanting to recognize the Confederates as an actual state or country, still called it the Merrimack.
Again, trying to avoid giving the government of the Confederacy legitimacy, to avoid getting a foreign power involved.
And as you can see, I have a drawing of it right here.
The catch is the Merrimack wasn't even a really good ship. She could only make about 4 knots, meaning she was extremely slow. She leaked a lot. Her engines were a problem because they were not designed to handle heavy armor plating. And the fact of the matter is, cannonballs can actually punch through it. Her armor. Traditional solid cast iron cannonballs could punch right through her armor. But the thing is that the guns on the ship she faced in her famous battle at Hampton Roads were untrustworthy. They didn't trust the guns, so they loaded them only to half powder, meaning the balls just bounced right off the armor.
And
And
next,
and the explosive shells that the Virginia fired, or the Merrimack fired, did very little damage to the turret of the other ship.
and
I deliberately kept it.
next
The
is
ship
the
I was-
Monitor.
The ship I spoke of.
Now, this is a very interesting ship because it's kind of a cross between a submarine and an ironclad because most of it is underwater. Like
It is a very low-riding vessel.
It's a low riding. Most of it's underwater except for the very top of the deck and the turret with 2 massive cannons in it. Which
And-
actually, I think, fun fact, the cannons were designed to have enough powder in them that they would just blow through metal plate like nothing. But the previous prototypes were known to explode, but these were newer versions that were tested not to explode, but soldiers, or they still didn't trust the design, so they still
More like they
load
didn't
it.
trust the designer because the designer was the same guy that built the ship.
Yeah, and
He was a
they-
little bit
they
of an
didn't-
oddball and a maverick.
But they still didn't trust it, so they didn't load it up to its full capacity. So
When she went to face the Merrimack or the Virginia, the cannonballs just harmlessly bounced off.
yeah,
But
if they had loaded them fully, it may have had a different impact. But
the catch is, though, the Monitor was just as flawed as the Merrimack. She had water leaked in around the turret. She was low riding. She couldn't handle heavy swells, and she was designed to operate in shallow water. She couldn't go out into heavy swells in the sea. But she was slightly faster. She could do 6 knots. As opposed to the sluggish 4 knots of the Virginia. She
But
could
also-
dance circles around her and stay in the shallow waters, where the Virginia, with her deeper draft, had to stay in the deeper waters of Hampton Roads.
but as you notice, we're actually showing an actual, very clear black and white picture, and it's not actually a super common thing to find a very clear black and white picture from the Civil War era.
Well, no, you could find a lot of pictures from the Civil War era. The thing is that you won't find from them is action shots because of how long it takes to set up an actual freaking photograph back then, and the fact you can't really capture action shots in that day.
The reason, and we actually, when we went to a Civil War reenactment ground, where they would basically like do a little reenactment of the Civil War, they would like fire off some cannons and some muskets, rifles, and it was pretty cool. One of the guys who was dressed up as a soldier told us that the reason you don't see soldiers smiling in the photos is because it would take almost a minute to take one photo, so you wouldn't want to be smiling because you can't really, because it might your muscles might get sore. So
Yeah, you get a little
you
sore
just kind of
face.
stand still and stiff. That's why you don't really see smiling pictures. Because even if you move the slightest bit, it would become blurry.
Yeah, it would get smudged. The Monitor also was a very fine vessel in terms of what it could do. And the fact is, just talking about Hampton Roads real quick, just going on this for just a brief second. The Battle of Hampton Roads was not that significant for the Civil War. The Monitor had protected the small escort at Hampton Roads for the invasion of the Virginia Peninsula where Richmond was. But it had an enormous impact on the global scale because it meant that wooden ships were done. Iron ships could be done. Because guess what France and Britain started doing, the two leading world powers? They started ramping up, they started pumping more money and resources into their ironclad programs, trying to crank it up as much as possible because they knew that they could not risk falling behind the United States now that the U.S. had ironclad vessels that could fight.
And because of that, by the turn of the century, metal ships were the norm.
And wooden vessels were completely abandoned as weapons of war.
Yes.
Because the Merrimack had made it very clear that wooden vessels could not do much against an ironclad foe.
And even eventually, even for civilian use, like just traveling wooden ships would also be abandoned. And now they're more of a novelty. Anyway, so that is all for the Civil War. Now we're going to move on to our number 2. Alright, time for our number 2 spot.
You might be shocked by what it is. World War II. Okay, so in this one, the Germans basically, due to the disaster that was the First World War for Germany, and and the result that occurred because of it, basically caused Germany to become very aggressive. When the Great Depression hit like a flaming semi-truck falling on my face, basically the economy went down the drain. And an Austrian madman, mind you, he was an Austrian, not German. Austrian. Mm-hmm. There's a difference.
Angry mustache model. Hitler himself.
Hitler radicalized the Germans, and with his group, basically led a plan to create what he called Lebensraum, living space for the master races. So here we have the American soldiers. America really kind of didn't get its act together till about 1943. Primarily because we didn't enter the war until 1941. Because if you count the Japanese, the war started in 1931.
Yeah.
If you count the Japanese wars of territorial expansion.
Yeah, well,
But most people don't really start the war till 1939, when Germany began its war of expansion.
that's when like everyone started going to war because it was just Japan in 1931,
And
then you also had the Spanish Civil War throughout the 1930s,
and the Italians in 1937 going after Abyssinia or Ethiopia. Okay, so basically the U.S. was extremely isolationist and actually disarmed itself very heavily after World War II, after World War I. So what happened is that by World War II, we really didn't have much of a standing army. So when World War II broke out, we kind of got ticked off. And eventually what happened was it only got worse from there. We got hammered at every turn until we finally had some key changes. We eventually halted the Germans in the Battle of the Atlantic, eventually stalled the Germans in the Battle of the Atlantic, and won a very decisive victory at Midway. At Midway, we sank 4 Japanese carriers, including 2 super carriers the Japanese had built. Mm-hmm. And they only had 1 new carrier under construction. We had 7 new carriers under construction. So they would never be able to replace those carriers. And they lost, out of like 500 pilots, they lost 250. That's over half their elite pilot fighter corps. They basically lost all that initiative that could help them go on the offensive to the point where they would be thrown back on the defensive for the duration of the war. So, if you're looking at this map, what you see here is a map of Europe by, I'd say, 1941 to 1942. 1942,
yeah, because you can see Germany has a lot of territory.
It's 1941. Because what you have here is you have northern France is under Nazi occupation, along with Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, along with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, along with Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Yugoslavia, and Greece, and especially Crete.
And you can also tell Germany has occupied a good portion of Russia.
Yes, Germany has also invaded Russia, and it is at the brink of victory. Leningrad is under siege, German panzer divisions are at the gates of Moscow, and Stalingrad is under siege.
Yeah.
And then you have the French forces here in North Africa, the Vichy French, which are basically puppets of Hitler's Third Reich. Then you have the Italians in Albania and in Italy, in North Africa supporting the Germans. Then you have Germany's secondary allies of Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria.
And then you have neutral Sweden, which they didn't really care.
Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey pretty much stayed out of the war for a long time. Same with the Irish Free State, the Irish Republic. Meanwhile, the two powers that stand alone against all this mess, the British Empire and the Soviet Union.
And then America would eventually jump in probably a few months later.
This is the war on the global scale. Libya is owned by Italy at the time, and unfortunately, the British, and unfortunately for the Italians, the British basically overran Abyssinia and Somalia pretty quickly. Basically, any Italian holdings out here in East Africa fell pretty quickly once the British got involved. And Libya was overrun pretty quickly until the Germans sent the legendary Africa Corps under command of the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, a man who I have deep respect for a key reason. Erwin Rommel was not a Nazi. He was a German patriot, but he was not a Nazi. He did not execute Jews, he did not execute Gypsies, he did not execute prisoners. He was not a racist, he was not a bigot, he was not a Nazi. He was a German patriot. He would not, like General Lee with the state of Virginia, he would not dare fight his home country of Germany. And you can see that most of the French territories here in Africa that aren't dominated by the British, because the British are beginning to attack, are under the thumb of the Vichy French. You can see that this is also about the same time period as the map that we just saw of Europe. It's 1942, January 6th.
You can tell Axis power is not at war with Japan.
Allied.
Allied, not in war with Japan, only Russia.
Yeah, pretty much. Then you've got the Allied powers. That includes Britain. The remainder of the French Empire that is commanded by the Free French. That includes the Middle Eastern territories and other territories across Africa. And anything not occupied by the Vichy French or anything else. And, of course, by this point, the United States. And also the British Empire. And of course, the Dutch Free Territories out here, too.
Yeah,
And then you got Finland and its private war with the Soviet Union. And then you got the Axis powers, which is the Vichy French, Italy, Germany, the fascist powers across Europe. That would include Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, and, of course, Thailand, which wanted to keep its empire. So it sided with Japan for the sake of protecting itself. And also Japan.
Yep. Alright, time for the weapons. Now, where do I start? I love weapons of the World Wars. I can get into them all day.
But I think it's only fair if we start with the most beautiful and elegant rifle ever created for World War II.
Yeah, the M1 Garand, claimed by Patton as the greatest implement of battle.
The greatest battle implement ever devised.
Yeah, which was the first semi-automatic rifle to be produced in large quantities. Developed by John Canty as Garand. He pronounced his own name Garand, but U.S. soldiers pronounce the name of the weapon Garand. And so, it depends. True diehards of this weapon will call the weapon the Garand, but call the man's name Garand, because that's how the man pronounced his own name. So, just make up your own judgment. I don't really care.
But basically,
It
this weapon is by far one of the most famous American rifles.
It was fed via an 8-round stripper clip that, once all the rounds were shot off, it would eject with a loud, audible ping sound.
But basically, it also does lead to a little bit of a problem.
Yeah. It was the cause of the death of many GIs in World War II, and even in Korea and Vietnam, where it was used in very limited quantities. Though, of course, by that point, it would have been replaced by the M14 and then the M16.
Yep.
And tragedy ensued. But they also used that ping to their advantage by loading a full clip, and then taking an empty clip, throwing it on a hard surface like a rock or concrete or something like that, and it would make that same pinging sound. And so, and they would know that's the sound that the guy's out of ammo, so they pop their head up and you shoot him.
Yeah, because they're thinking, oh, he's out of ammo.
And it was leaps ahead what the Germans had when we first entered World War II, because by that point, they didn't have a successful semi-automatic rifle. Around the time Germany was experimenting with their own semi-automatic rifles, like the Gewehr 41, sorry. But it was heavily flawed and very unsuccessful. And so, at the time when America entered the war, Germany was still mostly using the Kar 98K, and they would just be outclassed because they had one shot to where you had 8 at a time, at least.
Yeah, before they had to mess with the bolt. Now, eventually the Germans did come up with a better weapon.
And that is the STG-44. Now, of course, in 1943 they did come up with their own successful semi-automatic rifle, the Gewehr 43, though technology
Same
was
time
still,
as this, actually. In 1943.
In 1943, this weapon was devised the MP-43, which in 1944 would be renamed the STG-44, short for the Sturmgewehr 44, or storm weapon, storm rifle, or pistol rifle.
Now, the reason why it was at first, why it was produced in 1943, but it has the name STG-44, is because that it has a little bit of a confusing backstory.
In 1943, this weapon was devised, of course, the MP-43, and it was designed to use an intermediate round, so it could be used on semi-auto and fully automatic with a good, reasonable degree of accuracy, and so soldiers could carry more rounds of ammunition. And it was displayed, and it was asked to be put into service, and Hitler denied it because he didn't see the pursuit of an intermediate round as necessary, seeing that his troops only needed bolt-action rifles, SMGs, and machine guns, because that's what a German squad consisted of. You had 2 men working a machine gun, 7 men with bolt-action rifles, and 1 with an SMG. Everything revolved around the machine gun. And you would have your SMG as your...
Officer.
Actually, no, your close-range fire support for the MG, so it would stay close to the MG. And then a little further out, you would have your bolt-action rifles kind of scattered around, protecting that MG. So everything hinged around it, and that would be the premise for how the M60 would be used when it entered service. When Hitler was on a tour of the Eastern Front, he was given a demonstration of the MP-43 and was astonished by the performance of the weapon. And so in 1944, he sent him to service. He entered it into service almost immediately under the name STG-44.
For a propaganda win.
Or Sturmgewehr 44, the storm weapon, storm rifle, or pistol rifles, sometimes I've heard.
Or assault rifle.
Yeah.
Essentially, that's what it was.
That's where the name assault rifle actually comes from, if you don't know. The Sturmgewehr, which means storm rifle or storm weapon, that's where we get the name assault rifle. So, and though it came too late in the war to help influence Germany way too much, and instead most of the impact that it had would be on later rifle designs. For the AK-47 would use the same gas system, and America, of course, also take a lot of inspiration from it when creating the M16.
Mm-hmm.
And, like I said, the SMG of choice for Germany at the time was the MP-40.
9mm. High velocity.
Mm-hmm.
Very efficient.
And it was the perfect accommodant for the MG42 as a close-range fire support. Not meant to be super accurate, but could keep your enemy at bay and keep them away from the machine gun.
The catch is, the funny thing is, the next weapon we actually have was actually accurate with a slower bullet.
Mm-hmm. You have here the Thompson. Now, the Thompson started out as a weapon designed during World War I and entered service directly after the war in the early 1920s and became associated with a lot of crime, like the mafia in the 1920s.
Oh, the mob!
And it was nicknamed the Tommy gun, and was very stylish. Went with the fedora and the cigar. So, and the
Cops
original
also got their hands on it, and they found it to be quite useful.
because it had the power. It had the small yet powerful 45 ACP pistol round, and those earlier versions were most popularly used with a 75 round drum magazine and a vertical pistol grip at the front of the weapon. Though, of course,
that's more of like the gangster style, because that's the kind of thing that you think of when you think of like sticking the gun out the window doing a gangster drive-by.
Though these drum magazines did take forever to reload each individual bullet into them, and the foregrip had the tendency to break if you weren't careful, and the drum also made rattling noises. So a lot of these things were changed, and the finished product we get is the M1A1 Thompson SMG, which would be used by Britain and America earlier in the war. But it was a little expensive, so eventually Britain would try and replace it with the Sten SMG, and America would try and replace it with the grease gun. And also the original Thompson used what was known as I think it was a blowback design, though this was found to actually be unnecessary, and so it was just given a much more simpler design. And the sights were also changed. So
But the main changes to the weapon that the Army greatly introduced, which definitely improved it as a good combat weapon from a street weapon for gangsters and criminals and even police.
Good for drive-by shootings.
Yeah, and stuff like that, was that they got rid of the forward pistol grip, vertical pistol grip. And what they switched it to was a horizontal forward grip, like what you would do on a rifle.
Like what you see right here in the picture.
And what they got rid of, and they also got rid of the 75 round drum magazine. It went for, how many rounds can that thing hold? It's a vertical clip.
It holds anywhere between 25 to 30, depending, because there were different types that I've seen. So 25 to 30.
Anywhere between 25 to 30 rounds in a vertical clip.
Mm-hmm. The one you're looking at right now is pretty long, so I would suggest that's a 30 round clip. Mm-hmm. There are ones that I've seen that are shorter that are the 25 rounds.
So that's basically the Thompson.
And of course, Russia also had their popular SMG of choice, which I mentioned earlier when talking about the Vietnam War when I introduced the AK-47. I mentioned this weapon was known to be excellently reliable and had a massive 71 round drum magazine. Which, yes, all this is true. It was a very reliable, easy to manufacture weapon that had a high rate of fire. And
it's a miracle that thing's still not in service.
Well, times have changed. SMGs, unless an SMG can get through body armor like the P90 or MP7, then it's not really that useful.
Mm.
So
unless someone comes up with a modern version of it, that thing's not coming back to life.
I don't know, but
I'm pretty sure that we keep finding as many of those things as we do find moistened Nagats, but we just find that many more moistened Nagats that you could literally buy one for about, maybe about $100. You could buy one. There's that many of them. They are dirt cheap for a gun. Hey, they're a good rifle. Very little kickback. Very good, easy sliding bolt.
Mm-hmm. Though by the time of World War II, they were starting to get outdated, and so that's why they had weapons like their semi-automatic SVT-40 and the fully automatic PPSH-41, which you see right here, of course.
Of course.
The classic Browning M2.
Or as the Army calls it, or as the Armed Forces call it, Ma Deuce.
Yep.
That's the gun's name.
This appeared in the early 1930s.
1935, actually.
Mid-1930s. And is probably the most popular 50 caliber machine gun in the world.
I'm pretty sure it's the only.
Well, there are probably more out there. It's just this one's the only one that gets any credit. Because, yeah. And it was invented by John Browning, of course. Worked on by him. Though, of course, I think he died in 1928 or 29. So, like the Browning high-powered, it was finished by co-workers of his or other people at the Browning factory or whatever.
Of course.
Plant. And it was a very successful 50 caliber machine gun, which was air-cooled and was typically mounted on airplanes, on top of tanks, or in some cases mounted in trench positions like bunkers or on tripods. And
And bombers often would carry like dozens or more of of these things, like B-29s, B-17s, B-24, B-25 bombers.
And
would carry
also,
dozens
as
of
you can
these
see in
things.
this picture, it actually ejects the shells out of the bottom, which is pretty unique. There are, of course, other guns like the Maxim ejected shells out of the bottom, and there are other guns that do that as well. But it's just not the most common thing to see, because usually you'll see them coming out of the side. But that was just for when it was, say, mounted on vehicles or planes. It was easier to eject it out of the bottom.
Yeah.
So, and of course, the Browning M2 wasn't necessarily the best for best mobile machine gun.
Yeah,
Germany,
it weighed quite a bit.
but Germany. Oh, and Browning M2 still used today, and I think it will stay that way for a while.
Unless you can get me a better machine gun, I'm taking that baby any day.
Of course, the Browning M2 was not really a mobile machine gun, but Germany did have their own, and it was the MG42. It was a variant of the MG34 that was improved for production, easier to produce. Basically,
And
almost
somewhat
all
cheaper in cost.
pretty much all the components for the weapon were just a sheet of metal that was put in a press.
Yep.
And it was very easy, cheap to produce, and had an extremely high rate of fire, which earned it the name Hitler's Buzzsaw.
Fun fact, though, this is actually the fastest non-electric firing machine gun in the world. No other machine gun in history has ever been able to top its speed unless it was electrically powered.
So yeah, the MG42, much easier for the Germans to make, produce, cost, and very fast firing, was a nightmare for soldiers on D-Day. And into some aircraft. You have the most elegant-looking fighter of all time. At least that's what it said. The British Spitfire. Of course, this one you can see today is a modern picture, and the machine guns have been removed. But it would usually have a couple 50 calibers or even 20mm cannons on later versions.
303 British Vickers, air-cooled versions, and on top of that, this is a special Spitfire, dual-seater.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, I just noticed that.
No,
Look.
no. I've looked in an aircraft book, and it said later versions would have like massive 20mm cannons.
Yeah,
autocannons
but
inside.
earlier models, when they first went into the Battle of Britain, actually had 8 Vickers machine guns, 303 caliber.
Yeah. And then we also have probably one of the greatest fighters of all time, the P-51D Mustang, which was an upgrade version of the P-51 Mustang with a Merlin engine, a British Merlin engine incorporated into the design.
God bless the Brits.
Which immensely improved its performance, and also included a belly tank, which allowed it to go overseas with the bombers and protect them. And also, one of the first I'm pretty sure the first successful jet fighter, the Me-262, developed by Germany.
This was the first one to see combat.
And though not many of them were made, and a lot of them were destroyed before they even saw battle, the ones that did make it into the air were terrifying because they were fast and they were hard to spot. And Allied soldiers say you really couldn't hit something that you couldn't see.
And the catch is that if those things got back behind anything,
Though
the turbulence would blow them out. It would blow the Allied pilots right out of the sky more than the guns.
Yep.
The turbulence that those things could put out due to those massive Junker fighters engines were incredible.
Though the engines, of course, they were like first generation. They were like pretty much first generation. So
Subsonic.
So they had reliability issues, but of course, after the war, kinks would eventually be ironed out, and jet fighters would evolve into what they are today. Incredibly fast and incredibly stealthy. And of course, the tanks. Why not? How about the very well mass-produced M4 Sherman, which
The tinderbox.
they lit on fire pretty easily and were not the best alone, but in numbers they were immensely successful.
Or you could just get a 70-pounder in and get the Sherman Firefly.
Yep. just you gotta flip it upside down. That's all you need.
Not the tank, the gun.
Yeah, not the. Then you also have the T-34, which the picture I'm showing here is the T-34-76, which used a T-34-85, sorry, which used a larger 85 millimeter cannon compared to the 76.2 on the original designs, and that was more effective in taking down the Tiger. Speaking of which, the Tiger hit.
Catch is actually in German. It's actually pronounced Tiger.
This tank was given to Hitler on his birthday, which was
In 1942.
1942. Actually entered service before the Panzer V, even though this one's actually designated the Panzer VI. Quite odd. And it had an 88 flak millimeter cannon and incredibly thick armor that could not be beaten for almost 3 months. But eventually anti-tank technology kept up. But it was slow and incredibly unreliable, so...
But that gun. Woo, Lord.
Yep. And of course, if there were tanks, you needed a way to destroy them. Early attempts were just large caliber weapons, like the 55 caliber Boys anti-tank rifle developed by Britain, which you did not want to actually fire in the picture that you see right here, because the recoil was crazy. You would actually see the weapon jump off the ground.
Now the catch is that also with these things is that it wouldn't actually knock out the tank, but it would kill it with a mobility kill.
You would aim for the track, and you would take out the tracks, and it wouldn't be able to move. And even though in like World Tanks or War Thunder, that's not really killing tanks, because video games you can still fight back. But in real life, if the tank can't move, it's not going to do much.
Well, you could still rotate the turret.
I know.
But if you can't angle your armor, you're screwed.
Yeah. But of course, eventually, people just want to destroy the tanks entirely. So you have things like the German Panzerschreck and the American bazooka, which, by the way, the bazooka is a rocket launcher. And bazooka is not a category of weapon, it is the nickname given to this particular type of rocket launcher. It was named that it was given that nickname by American soldiers because it actually resembled a French instrument called the bazooka. Of course, the atomic bombs. We have Little Boy, which was dropped over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It was a small uranium bomb. It weighed 9,000 pounds, and of course, 20,000 tons of TNT explosive capability. And of course,
a 20-kiloton bomb.
So
impressive for a first time.
So yeah, it was. Of course, I'm just reading these stats off the picture, and
then comes the fun one.
Then there's Fat Man, which the second point they have is it's nicknamed after Winston Churchill. I don't know if this is true, but I really hope it is. Because that would just be funny. And also, it was the second atomic bomb, and it was a plutonium one.
Which explains its size, actually. Uranium bombs don't require much, actually, to go off like that. They're very unstable. That's why we actually got away from uranium and went to plutonium. Is that it's a much more powerful substance, but it requires such a big force.
And of course, this one was dropped over Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, which was 3 days after Little Boy. Right?
And the catch is Nagasaki wasn't even the intended target.
It was
a backup target in case the bomber couldn't make it. And because of dense cloud cover up ahead from a storm, this target, they got diverted off their target, so they headed to Nagasaki.
And then they dropped the bomb over it.
Yeah.
So. And that is all for World War II.
Number 1.
Lastly, we have World War I. So,
yeah, you might
Caleb,
be able to...
why don't you explain why we chose this one?
Right. Well, on top of all of this, this war is by far the most influential because, first of all, it's what leads to World War I.
World War II.
World War II, that's what I meant.
It leads to itself.
Yeah, so, you know what I meant. It leads to World War II. And
it's the staging ground, basically.
Yes.
Everything that was to happen in World War II happened because of World War I.
Yes. And basically what happened after this is, what happened with this war is that after it, a lot of the old empires that were basically on their deathbeds finally were brought down. The German Empire, which had just been formed, was killed in its infancy, essentially. The Austrian Empire, which had been teetering on the brink of collapse for a long time, suddenly finally bit the dust. Same with the Ottomans and the Russians. The British and French empires were greatly weakened. and it basically paved the way for the U.S. to become the leading economic power in the world, aside from the British, even surpassing the French. But also, this was the first truly industrialized war, where women had to go into the workforce in order to replace the men sent to fight in the thousands, possibly millions. 11 to 17 million dead in this war. And it was terrible. This war was trenches, mainly on the Western Front. It was mainly just both sides had machine guns, both sides had rifles, both sides had gas weapons, both sides had bad artillery, so they had to dig in. And unfortunately, when the race to the sea began, where both sides kept trying to outflank each other to the north, at the Battle of the River, at the first Battle of Ypres in Belgium, the Allies desperately held on and prevented a breakthrough. The Allies were stuck in trenches, like what you see in this image here, with the British troops at the Somme. This is where the soldiers were stuck. They could barely move without getting killed. Because in one battle, the Allies advanced 10 miles at the cost of thousands of lives. For example, on the 1st of July in 1916, the British began the operation of the Battle of the Somme. By the end of the day, around 2,000 French were dead. 5,000 Germans. 57,000 British. The artillery was also getting a lot more dangerous. A lot of...
As evident by this scary-looking piece of equipment.
This is a British heavy cannon. And unfortunately, it's also one of the worst models. Later models proved to be far better. But this gun was basically a hunk of junk because its recoil system was a piece of garbage. It was a gigantic spring.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
That's because the French invented the better hydraulic recoil system.
Which
where one
was
had
literally illegal for you to actually open it up and examine it.
Yeah, when they brought the gun when the French brought the French 75mm field gun over to the United States, we couldn't take the darn thing apart to find out how it worked because it was a French national secret. So we adopted it as our own just to use it because it was just that good. In fact, as ceremonial pieces, sometimes in old forts, they actually still have some of those guns for a artillery salute. This is propaganda for the Battle of Verdun. Now, there is a whole motto, like a whole saying for the battle that was said by the French commander, General Nivelle. Allons enfants de la patrie. Aux armes citoyens. Entendez-vous dans les campagnes. Messieurs et filles et soldats. Ils ne passeront pas. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. And that's a different form of it. On ne passe pas. They shall not pass. Because ne pas is a negative connotation, meaning not to, or they shall not. On is another way of saying they, because you could either say il, which is ILS, which is masculine, or elle, which is ELLES, which is feminine, or on, which could mean either one. And then passe means pass. They shall not pass. And what that whole thing I said was, arise, citizen, arise, sons of arise, soldiers of your country, arise, soldiers of the nation. Allons enfants de la patrie. Aux armes, citoyens, to armed citizens. Entendez-vous dans les campagnes. Listen to the sounds in the fields. Listen to the sound, to the howling of these soldiers. They shall not pass. This was because Verdun was a very symbolic and sacred place to the French. Not like a religious sacredness, but a national pride symbol. Verdun was that important to the French. And they would not let the Germans take it. And the French paid dearly. Both sides suffered over 300,000 casualties in the battle. Both the Germans and the French. And the French held out. They committed themselves and stood strong in the promise to their commander, General Nivelle. They shall not pass. And this map shows actually around 1916 when the Battle of Verdun began. What you see here on this map is that the Ottoman Empire is already facing invasion from Africa and the Middle East here from the British.
Then you have Allied forces landing here at Salonika in Greece, trying to open up another front to support Serbia, but unfortunately they're too late. Bulgaria's
Yeah.
already joined.
If anyone doesn't really know what he's talking about, it's that little grayish, bluish patches in Greece, upper in Greece.
Yeah, the part that looks like it's got like that three-finger bit.
Uh-huh.
And then Albania, and Montenegro is about to be overrun. Serbia's been overrun by the Austrians and Bulgaria. Romania hasn't joined the Allies yet. Italy has joined the Allies. The Allies are still stuck here in the Western Front. The Russians have established this line here and are about to begin their Brusilov offensive, which was actually the most successful offensive of the war. The Russians were able to actually push up to 60 miles in some sectors, literally just running forward until they ran out of supplies and they got stalled. But they definitely put a lot of strain on it. And this was where a lot of the action really took place in Europe, but there was other fighting around the globe.
Like there was
Africa,
in the Middle East.
The Middle East, yes, but also in Africa.
Lawrence of Arabia.
Lords of Arabia against the Ottomans, but also in Africa, because Togo, the modern-day country of Togo, was the German colony of Togoland. You also have the British failure to take Cameroon. You also have the failure to take German Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia. Then you also have the constant bogging down in East Africa against Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck, the greatest guerrilla fighter in the world. He held on throughout the whole war, cut off from home, and he made the Allies have a run for their money. Belgium, Britain, and France. And also in the Pacific, Japan took control of the Marianas and the Caroline Islands. Also, Tsingtao, a German naval base in China. Plus, they also seized control of the Australians and the New Zealand also seized control of Samoa and the northern half of Papua New Guinea, which was under German control. So the war raged around the world, but most of the fighting was concentrated in Europe. But the real reason why we put this at number one, just to finish off my bit, was because this was the one that led to World War II and broke up those old empires, and also weakened the Allies. It eventually paved the way for the United States to become the lead economic power in the world, led to the end of the Tsar, the Kaiser, and the Ottoman Sultan, plus the Austrian Emperor as well. All those old empires, broken and dismantled, paving the way for World War II. And then to the modern Europe we know today.
On that same note, I consider World War I to be the war where most weapons that were used in World War II were first utilized and tested in World War I. Right now I have the bolt-action rifles, which bolt-action rifles, the first big extensive use of them was in World War I. Of course, they had been used in smaller wars like
the wars that led to German unification, because basically Prussia, the greatest of the northern German states, basically kicked around everybody in order to create a single unified Germany around them. They beat the crap out of the Danes, the Austrians, and then the French, and they had a bolt-action rifle.
And so I have 4 different bolt-action rifles. Now there are 5 big countries. I don't have a picture of France's bolt-action rifle, but that one is the 1885 Lebel, which actually, what I've heard, was the first, or no, I think it was a much, no, from what I've heard, I think this was the first weapon, first firearm to use smokeless powder, which was impressive. Or I think it was an older French bolt-action rifle. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it was the Lebel. So, and then also I have the very iconic German Gewehr Mauser 1898, which, of course, as it suggested, was made in 1898 and was the mainstay bolt-action rifle of Germany up until 1934-35, when the Kar 98K came out, which was a carbine version of it.
Many Germans today still look back at this and the Kar 98K with an uttermost amount of respect.
And it was said to have, its bolt-action mechanisms was said to be reliable, being both fast and strong, and almost all modern hunting rifles that are bolt-action,
and sniper rifles that are bolt-action.
take the Mauser as its base. it is the basis for many of these. And even for America, with the M1903 Springfield, as shown right here, when the Krag Jorgensen was starting to show its age and was showing to not be as reliable
In the Spanish-American War.
they would begin taking the Mauser, tweaking it and refining it, and creating their own version, which was the M1903 Springfield.
And the funny thing is, we forgot to ask the Germans for permission.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of things like...
We basically had to pay them to use it while we were shooting at them with it in World War One.
There was a phrase that went along with the Springfield: if you heard it fire, you're already dead.
The weapon of silent death.
Quite...
It certainly was effective, because there was a situation under a small platoon under Sergeant York in World War One. Was facing a large company of Germans, somewhere between 200 of them. When the Americans opened fire, they opened fire from a long distance, and about half the Germans got knocked out. Like, about 50 were dead, and another 50 were wounded, leaving the 100 that were still left to back off till they could get reinforcements, because the Americans were in a dug-in position on a high ground in Bellow Wood, where they were dug in and they did not budge. Plus, we were also bigger than everybody else back then. Apparently, for some reason, according to genetics, somehow we shot up to about 6'3", 6'4", and everyone else was still at like 5'9".
So,
leave it to the giant Americans.
then you have... Next one here is the Lee Enfield.
This was basically the last rifle of the British Empire.
I will say, it's actually... Its designated name is the Short Magazine Lee Enfield. Because it was... Or SMLE for short. And it was an improved version of the Lee Metford, or Long Magazine Lee Enfield, which the long and short is not talking about its magazine. It was actually talking about how long the weapon was. And the Lee Enfield was a shortened version of the Lee Metford. But it was unique in that it held 10 rounds instead of the traditional 5 that most bolt-action rifles at the time carried.
Two 5-round stripper clips.
And they'd be loading, of course, at the top. And
303 British caliber.
And because of that, the British soldiers could pull off what was known as a Mad Minute.
30 rounds aimed at a target more than 200 meters distance in under a minute. And most trained soldiers could actually do more than that. And it had the perfect bolt designed for it. Fast, smooth, and easy. You didn't even have to break your line of sight when you pull back the bolt.
Yeah, actually, the way that worked is with something like the Mauser or the Springfield, the effort you'll be using when cocking the bolt, most of your effort in cocking and the force that will actually chamber your next round is pulling the bolt backwards. But with the Lee Enfield, most of that effort's actually pulling the bolt up, which for most bolt-action rifles would just unlock the bolt. But for this, it actually unlocks it and cocks at the same time, where you just pull it back to get it ready and back forward. It was revolutionary.
Very revolutionary for a bolt-action rifle. Very credited. Bravo to the Brits. Best of British.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you got to give them credit. This was the last rifle of the British Empire.
And its story almost ended before it started, because, like America, they ran into the Mauser and decided they wanted to develop
The Americans ran into it with the Spanish-American War. Oh, that's what we ran into it with, and the British with the Boer War, with the Boers, the Dutch, South Africans. That kept causing a problem.
They wanted to develop their own, but World War I came and they dropped that and just ended up mass-producing the Lee Enfield.
And that weapon never looked back.
Though it, of course, was kind of expensive, so in, I believe it was 1916, the Mark III Star would come out, which was the same thing but easier to produce. So
cheaper and easier.
And of course, in 1896, Russia would adopt this rifle, the Mosin Nagant.
This is actually one of my favorite bolt-action rifles outside of the Lee Enfield, because the fact is, it actually is a very, very smooth bolt. Not as smooth as the Enfield, but second best.
It is a very standard length, good design, and on top of that, very little kickback, very decent amount of kickback on that. So it won't be like that, but it'll be like it's like a standard rifle, and it's a very rugged design. And the catch is, it's very cheap because of how much the Russians produced this in World War One and World War Two. They overproduced it.
In World War One, they used the standard Mosin Nagant, and in World War Two, they used the carbine version.
Mm-hmm.
And it was it was their mainstay. And of course, all these sniper rifles of World War One were just
the last rifle of the Tsars.
Were just these same bolt-action rifles, but of course with scopes and maybe some other minor modifications. Of course, machine guns were the first major war where machine guns were used were in this. And of course, the first was right here. I'm showing the Maxim machine gun. Now, there were many different variants of Maxim machine gun. Of course, this is a variant with a water jacket. This was a very common variant to see in World War One. And previous attempts like the Gatling gun were rapid fire, but not automatic. What the Maxim does different is allows... it takes the recoil of each individual bullet to cock back the hammer and eject the spent cartridge and load in a new one simultaneously. And with pouring water in the water jacket, you could sustain fire. And it was a very effective design.
Especially for trench warfare, because if you get stuck in trenches, this is the weapon that caused it, along with its unholy marriage to barbed wire.
Of course, many countries would adopt it and modify it themselves.
Especially the Germans.
And they would diverge into their own weapons. Probably the most unchanged version was the Russians, with in 1912 making their own version of the Maxim, which was the exact same thing, but with a different water jacket, which was designed to take chunks of ice and snow so it could be used in cold conditions.
Because water would freeze and it would ruin the gun, because the barrel would either get squished or the water jacket would burst from the expanding ice.
Yeah.
So what they would do is they'd either take snow or small chunks of ice and just cram it down in through a snow cap on top of the water jacket, and that would melt to keep the barrel cool as it fired.
Yeah.
But of course, they'd have to empty it out every time, or else the barrel would freeze over again, and that would ruin the gun. And due to the economic strains that Russia was under at the time, and the massive inflation and the economic mismanagement at home, the Russian government would never be able to substantiate that.
Next, we have the British, which they would modify the Maxim machine gun in getting the Vickers machine gun. And this is a pretty interesting picture because they're wearing gas masks and firing this thing. And this thing has a lot of interesting traits. I'll get into this. The original Maxims, they ejected the brass from the bottom. The Vickers ejects it from the side like a lot of guns nowadays do. And it also made the weapon smaller and slightly lighter, basically having the receiver lock up instead of down, which allowed that large portion of the receiver on the bottom, which you see in the previous picture, to be removed, making the gun smaller. Though it still wasn't light enough to carry with one person. You still need a team of 4 to 5 men to operate it.
I think actually in the top 10 machine guns, they actually said it was 6.
Yeah, it was somewhere around there. It was like a large team. And
the thing is also, it had a little bit of a design problem that they didn't see coming until it was a little bit too late.
You can't see in this picture, but on the other side of the box on the back, there is a hammer, or a lever, the cocking lever, which before you fired every shot, before you would get firing, of course, you would load in the belt and then cock that. I think it was just once. Because the Maxim, with the original design, you had to cock it twice, because it would be paired around, then it would load it directly into the
It would load it onto the firing plate, then actually put it into the chamber with the second cock.
Yeah. With the Vickers, you only had to do it once, but every time it fired,
that handle would kick back.
That handle would kick back, and it could cause severe damage to your knuckles if it hit. So the British soldiers were taught to hold their fingers high on the weapons, and as you can see, the British soldier in this photo is doing that with his index fingers high on the handles. It is the most accurate machine gun in history. It hasn't been topped. It can hit a man-sized target from 2,000 meters away, which has never been matched by any modern machine gun to this day. which that is incredibly impressive. Leave it to Britain to do something like that.
Best of British.
I think World War I, Britain was definitely at the top of innovation. They made a lot of innovations.
They were the world's #1 superpower for a reason.
And
the
then-
sun never sets on the British Empire, love.
Next, we have the MG08/15. Now, the MG08/15 was a attempt at a mobile light LMG, built off the MG08 design, which was basically the German version of the Maxim.
There technically is a way they actually could have made it an LMG. If they had gone with a
It
bigger...
actually it's designated an LMG, but it's not incredibly light.
No, the thing is the way they actually could have gotten it lighter. If they had adopted a Vickers style approach with the design.
Yeah, but with this the bolt still locks downwards like on the original Maxim, so it still has that bulky design. But it was actually, I'm pretty sure it was still relatively light, and if you could hold on to it for long, you could actually sustain fire by the hip. But more often than not, it was operated by a team of 2, and they would lie and they would carry it into battle, and then they would lie prone on their bellies in the field firing.
Yeah, they would be in the prone position, which is lying down, facing forward, because with a weapon like that, you don't want to be standing. That thing, it's just too bulky for any kind of real maneuverability.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy from the future here. Anytime you hear me say Brachus, I mean to say Borchardt. I just didn't know how to pronounce it when we were recording the video.
Now getting on to pistols. Self-loading pistols made their debut in the late 1800s. One of the earliest examples is the Brachus C96, which then evolved into the Luger, which we'll get into in a second. But the man was kind of ignorant. The design was very bulky and clunky, and they wanted him to simplify it, and he refused to. He thought the gun was perfect the way it was. And he failed because of this, because no one would buy his bulky design. Though of course, Mauser would design their own pistol in 1896, and that's what I'm showing right here, the Mauser C96. Now, this version is actually a variant that came along in early World War I. If you can tell by the 9 on the handle, it fires 9mm parabellum rounds. It was used alongside the P08 Luger, which was basically the improved version of the Brachus pistol, which Luger was the man who worked alongside Brachus while working on it, and when Brachus dropped out because he was being ignorant, Luger took over and improved the design, making it smaller. And this, alongside with the Mauser C96, which the famous Luger we know today, the P08, came in 1908, though the first Luger actually appeared in 1900, which the P08 essentially was the same thing as the 1900, but using the famous 9mm parabellum round. So, that and the Mauser C96 were the mainstay German sidearms. America, though, had something much more iconic. And
In fact, fun fact, as an ROTC cadet, I have learned this from actual officers. This pistol is still used today, even though it technically has been deemed out of service. Officers and soldiers will still carry this thing
special
as...
forces that get the choice to pick their firearms will more often not choose this over
Same
the
with infantry.
over the 9mm Beretta, which has 15 rounds. So that shows you this thing is trusted.
It is not only iconic, it is reliable, it is trustworthy, and it is a classic American pistol. The Colt M1911.
Now, I think the variant I'm showing right here... Oh, wait, no. This is an original M1911. The M1911A1 is slightly different, has a couple of ergonomic different features, like the little piece that sticks out at the back right below the hammer. Yes, right below the hammer. On the M1911A1, that is longer, so the hammer doesn't interfere with your hand too much. The trigger is slightly smaller, and there's a little bit of better curving around the grip. So, for the hand. And the M1911 was an improved version of the original Colt M1900 design, which was a much longer, which basically looked the same, but had a almost straight vertical handle instead of the tilted one you see on this design, and was much longer. But this had a 7-round box magazine on the bottom, which of course, and used Colt 45 ACP, and its design is so iconic that most modern pistols use its same design and even features and mechanical features inside it to date. Moving on to the aircraft, I have two notable aircrafts. First, we have the British Sopwith Camel. Very easy to make.
Almost impossible to fly due to the torque on that engine.
Like, the
catchy-
engine is the single heaviest component, because this thing is literally made out of fabric and wood.
And wiring.
Yeah, the fuselage was literally made by stretching fabric around a
Canvas around a wooden frame.
Yeah, that the fuselage where the fuel is held.
And the catch is, though, the reason why this is the case is that because the first few aircrafts that were flown, like in 1903 when the Wright brothers made their flight, is because that's what these aircrafts were made of. They were going for lightweight. They didn't realize that they could get metal to fly.
Mm-hmm. And and of course, earlier in the war, when aircraft were first starting to be used for military purposes, a German engineer had developed what was known as a synchronizing device for machine guns to be able to fire through the propeller.
Interrupter gear.
It fired in tangent with the propeller, so you could have it in between the propeller, so you could have a clearer line of sight and be able to shoot through the propellers while it's going off and spinning. And that would be, and the Sopwith Camel, when it appeared in 1916, was probably one of the first British aircrafts, I think, that had this feature as well.
And the reason why it has the name Sopwith Camel is because of the odd hump that it gets from the back end of those two Vickers machine guns.
And
It gets a little bit of a hump.
And speaking of Germany, here is the Fokker. Not something else, the Fokker. Okay.
It is the Fokker D7, a very good fighter aircraft.
And what we're seeing right here is actually a modern recreation of the Red Baron.
Manto von Richthofen, the Red Baron, 80 kills, just 2 machine guns, 80 kills, highest scoring ace in history. No modern ace has ever been able to top him.
Yeah.
And there was only one ace that ever came close. He was close by 5 kills. A French one. René Foch of France. Bonjour, je m'appelle René Foch.
Yeah. But the Fokker was the mainstay for Germany, and
It was actually a superior fighter aircraft to the Sopwith Camel.
though, surprisingly, it was the Sopwith Camel that actually shot down the Red Baron.
Ironically, but he was buried by, Manchek von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was actually buried by the Allies with full military honors.
That's quite ironic. Kind of odd.
Well, I mean, he was well respected. I mean, 80 kills. No ace has ever been able to top him.
Even with like today's super stealthy subsonic fighters that
Supersonic.
once they spot a target, that target's dead. I mean,
You can't top 80 kills with just 2 machine guns.
and of course, ships. We have this World War I Dreadnought, which you said is
HMS Dreadnought.
the HMS Dreadnought. So
She was the first of her class.
So you explain, because I don't know much.
Basically, there were several ships of her class: HMS Dreadnought, HMS Bellahorn, Bellefonds, a handful of them. But basically, what these things were was basically just heavy metal warships with steam engines. These things were an improvement over ironclads. They were the far superior, and Britain had 29 of these bad boys when war broke out. Germany was second in the world with Navy at 19. Britain had at least 10 more battleships to Germany.
Moving on, we have a World War I U-boat, and these were mainly utilized by Germany, and they were used to destroy Allied shipping.
They had a service range of around 9,000 miles.
And
They didn't really attack with torpedoes, though.
yeah, well, torpedoes first came around in World War I, and these first generation, even by World War II, they were still unreliable. One of the worst things you could ever have was what was called the loop around, where the torpedo would actually come back at you and hit you and sink you. And but more often than not, your torpedo would hit and nothing would happen. It
Yeah,
wouldn't
it was like
explode.
they just hit the target and it'd
not
just
explode.
be a dud. It'd be like a dud.
So
round.
more often than not, and they wouldn't spend too much time underwater because it drained a lot of their precious fuel.
And they needed the
So-
fuel to keep the batteries running.
In this picture, you can see a deck. You can see a gun on deck, and that's what they use more often than not. And they destroyed hundreds of Allied ships with these guns.
Until the Allies began grouping their merchant fleets, their merchant ships into large convoys protected by naval escort. That's when the U-boats couldn't really utilize that, and they had to stay below, which would drain their fuel.
So yeah, but even in World War II, the Germans still use U-boats and use similar tactics like this.
In World War II, it was even worse because the Germans took advantage of the Mid-Atlantic Gap,
Yeah.
which was a massive gap at which land-based aviation could not support
And
the merchant fleets.
you know that old saying, the best counter to something is itself? Well, the problem was, no one but Germany really had submarines, because Britain, they did have submarines. But they didn't really use them because they were seen as ungentlemanly weapons. Because Britain, you know?
The British... Okay, real quick, just a little touch-up on that. The British naval defense at Scapa Flow, one of the main navy yards in northern Britain, in Scotland, mind you. Their anti-submarine threat was, if they spotted a periscope, they would row over in a little paddle boat and have a mallet, and if they saw a periscope pop up, they would hit it with the mallet.
And, of course, chemical warfare was definitely a big part of World War I. And
Mustard
you can see right here, these are either British or American, I can't tell. I would suspect by the poofy pants it's American. I don't know.
Nope, those are Brits.
Those are Brits? Okay.
Yeah, those are Brits.
Alright. And they are wearing gas masks. Well, because Britain and America use the same helmet in World War I.
The Mark I steel helmet.
Yep. And
That, or we use the French Adrian helmet.
there were a lot of very bad types of gases that came out. Probably the worst and most
Chlorine
dreaded.
and
Mustard gas.
That
Probably one of
can
the most dreaded.
that can melt your eyeballs out of your head. And there was even rumor that the Germans were trying to develop a hydrogen-based form, like what we see in the Wonder Woman movie. There was actually a rumor that the Germans were actually trying to invent that. But the German government got involved and actually said, no. That would kill our own men just as bad as we would kill the Allies. No. And the German High Command actually listened to it because the Kaiser intervened and said, heck to the no.
Speaking on barbaric types of weapons, when America came into the war, they introduced the real first combat shotguns, like the M97 Winchester trench gun. And it was a devastating weapon at close range, great for trench warfare, but Germany saw it as a barbaric weapon, and so they responded by telling the U.S. government, if we find one of your soldiers with this weapon, we will kill that guy on the spot. The American government responded by saying, then if we find any of your soldiers with gas grenades or a flamethrower, which they were very fond of using, we'll kill them on the spot. So, yeah.
And the Germans were desperate for manpower, so the Germans backed off.
Yeah. Of course, tanks made their first debut. Of course, Britain with their...
Battle of the Somme, 1916.
Mhm.
4-month-long battle. They introduced these things for the first time.
Britain-
Near the village of Flers.
Yep.
In France.
Britain first introduced the Mark I heavy tank. Kind of rushed in and very mechanically unreliable, but definitely terrifying for its time. Nothing
And it paved
ever
the way
liked
for
it.
future designs.
And just think about this. Most of the German soldiers that were going up against this most of them hadn't even seen a car in their life.
And the funny thing is, Germans invented cars.
But yeah,
It was Mercedes-Benz.
Cars wouldn't necessarily be mass-produced until Ford in the 1920s, right?
That's a good point.
So
Very good point.
most of these German soldiers hadn't even seen a car, so motorized vehicles were foreign to them.
Other than tractors. But even then, something this big and armed?
And more often than not, they would shout phrases like, "The devil is coming."
Those monsters are coming. The devil is coming.
And they were just terrified by these things because they would crush their barbed wire and just destroy their entrenched positions with either 6-pounder cannons or mow them down with tons of machine guns. And the best versions were the Mark IV and Mark V, which Mark V entered kind of late in the war. So the Mark IV was the most widely used of the British tanks, and I have a picture of a Mark IV right here. This is a male version with two 6-pound cannons.
They were called male because they just had the big guns. Females were the ones with the machine guns.
They only had machine guns.
Yep.
Males had machine guns and the cannons. But also, this was the first tank that fought in tank-on-tank combat, and I'll get to that in a second when we get to the tank that it fought up against. But first of all, France created the design for the modern tank, and this design has been copied.
Not completely,
It
but
has been copied. The design has been copied and used in modern tanks. The basic design: tracks on the bottom, hull in between the tracks, dividing two compartments, engine compartment and crew compartment, turret on top of the crew compartment, housing its main armament. Believe it or not, having the engine in a separate compartment was a new thing at the time. Revelation.
yeah, because the British engine on their tanks was in the middle of the tank.
In the crew compartment. If you play Battlefield 1, you know what I'm talking about. The first chapter of the campaign, you're playing as a guy part of a tank crew. The early British tanks, I just want to say, engines, no lights in there. It was dark. It was noisy. The engine was extremely noisy, hard to see. And apparently the British didn't get the memo that the exhaust from the engine is
Supposed to be vented out of the tank?
Instead, the exhaust just vented into the crew compartment. It had really no exhaust port. And that problem wasn't fixed until the Mark V in 1918. At the end of the war. 2 years after the tank was
And the catch is also, there was another thing, like the uniforms that these guys had to wear. They had, because of the way the armor reacted to machine gun fire, they had to wear all leather uniform with a chainmail mask.
Yeah.
In a hot, exhaust-filled vehicle where you could most likely pass out. Yeah, that was not fun.
Alright. Then we have the Sturmpanzerwagen
A7V.
A7V. This was the first German tank to see action, though only 20 of these things were ever made, and only one has actually survived to the modern day, and is currently in the Australian Tank Museum.
Okay, so we were going to mention the first tank-on-tank battle?
Yes, it was at Villers Britanniques. I can't pronounce the thing. I butchered it.
Villers Bretonneux.
So, yeah, what he said.
Villers Bretonneux.
And what was the date?
April 24th, 1918.
Yeah, in the closing stages of the war, it was 3 Mark IVs.
2 female, 1 male.
Yeah, 2 female, 1 male, and 3 A7Vs. And so basically, the 2 females got injured. Were
hit.
They were hit and they were injured, so they backed up. But the male was still going, though they only had 1 gunner. The other gunner had been wounded and couldn't operate the gun, is what I heard. And so they only had 1, and they kept shooting on the lead tank, and the lead tank kept shooting back the lead A7V, because there was a lead one and then 2 right behind it.
The catch is, though, about this battle, it's very, very much play by ear, in a manner of speaking, because they had never done tank-on-tank combat before.
Like, they kind of improvised in the moment. And on the move, firing at a tank on the move back then.
No gyroscopic gun sights. No gyroscopic gun stabilizers.
Yeah.
That thing, you base the gun, if you got bounced too much, the gun could drop.
Yeah, but so they made the risky decision. The Mark IV male that was still there stopped. The commander told them to stop to get a clear shot. It shot. I think first shot ricocheted off, and then second shot
hit the driver commander cupola on top of the lead A7V.
And then I think the second shot, it went through the armor and it hit something and exploded, and then the tank flipped over.
It hit it hit a part of the engine.
And let me tell you something. You see the picture right here. You see what's that? 9 people.
Yep.
That's half of the A7V's crew.
These things took...
This is what I call the clown car of tanks. 18 men to operate. So you lost a lot of men when one of these things is lost.
It was a waste of time.
And so, and once the lead tank was lost, the other two A-7Vs retreated, leaving the Mark IV.
The sole possessor of the battlefield.
Yep. The last thing I want to get onto is actually not a weapon, but a piece of equipment that was revolutionary in its design, even though very simplistic. It is the Stahlhelm helmet.
In fact, its design can still be seen today in the American K-Pot helmet.
That were introduced in the 1980s and are still used today.
You want to know how I know that? MS3s.
Yeah.
They get MS3s in ROTC, where I go to school at. They get the helmets.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we do lab, they
And
pull up the K-Pot.
this helmet was not like any helmet before, like the British and American helmets.
Like the French Adrian helmet, the Mark I steel helmet from the UK, US.
Or the original German helmets, which were not really for protection, but they have the spikes. But had the spikes on for
They
close-range combat.
they were Prussian. They were still called Stahlhelms, but the Stahlhelm somethings. But they were really meant for decoration. In fact, they actually German soldiers before the Stahlhelm even came out, they actually were forced to dull the spikes and dull out the shininess on all of this embrazured stuff on their helmets because it was more for ceremony and not for actual field deployment.
And it was Germany who really came up with the idea of a helmet that was actually meant to protect the soldier, with the Stahlhelm design being wear low on the head to actually protect the neck, somewhat the shoulders, and of course the head. And it was
Very
very
similar,
good.
actually, to the Roman helmets of the legions.
And it was very good at reflecting fragmentation and even pistol rounds, like the American 45 ACP, which for the time was a powerful pistol round.
Low velocity, but it did damage.
And of course, this would go on to be the inspiration for the and this helmet would still be used by Germany in World War II. Of course, Hitler being a fanboy of anything used in World War I that was iconic by the Germans.
Of course.
And it would be used in America's helmet designs in World War II and the recent K-Pots from the 1980s. And just overall was a leap ahead because at the time, most helmets were just decorational until this thing, and it saved a lot of soldiers' lives.
Yeah, like the Mark I steel helmet was more like a flat disc with a divot for your head to fit in. The Adrian helmet was decent, but it mostly just covered the top of your head and part of your neck behind. It
And-
never really covered the whole head.
And with how surprising this thing was revolutionary and how well it was to protect them, it was very easy to make. It basically was just a sheet of metal that was pressed in a stamp.
Yep.
And it
pretty
was a reinforced steel, something like that. So
much. It was like a nickel steel alloy that was reinforced with a little bit with aluminum.
yep. So anyway, we hope you all enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and a comment if you did, and subscribe if you already haven't. If you're new here, of course, check out all the stuff we do on Phantom Studios. Of course, go check out my gaming channel, Phantom Studios Gaming. Of course, and thank you, Caleb, for helping out with this video.
I am glad that we were able to do this in one night.
Yeah, we definitely did have fun discussing all this, and I'm going to be spending a lot of time editing this. So anyway, we hope you all enjoyed this video. I'm Jeremy Temple, or Jeremiah Germs, and this is
Caleb Temple.
and we will see you all next video. Goodbye.
Guten Tag, or Guten Nacht.